Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. Now let's get into the case. The morning dew clung to the vibrant undergrowth as Dr. Karen Wilson carefully navigated the narrow trail winding through Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The early June sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of oak, maple, and hickory, trees creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor that shifted with each gentle breeze. Karen paused to wipe a bead of sweat from her brow, adjusting the weight of her backpack filled with research equipment, specimen containers, and her lunch for the day. At 42, she had spent nearly 2 decades studying the rich botanical diversity of the Smokies, but the thrill of discovery had never diminished. Today promised to be particularly productive. She had identified a remote area of the park that might harbor several rare species of Trillium she was documenting for her ongoing research on climate change effects on Appalachian flora. The soft chirping of birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush accompanied Karen as she hiked deeper into the wilderness. As a seasoned field researcher, she was well accustomed to the solitude that came with her work. Her colleagues often teased her about her preference for working alone, but she found that the isolation allowed her to notice subtle details in her surroundings that might otherwise be missed amid conversation. Besides, she wasn't completely alone. Her research assistant Jason Chen was working in another section of the same valley, about a mile away, and they checked in via radio every few hours as a safety protocol. Karen's mind drifted to the grant proposal she needed to finish by the end of the month as she carefully stepped over a fallen log. The University of Tennessee's Botany Department, where she had been a professor for the past 12 years, had been supportive of her research, but funding was always a constant concern. This latest project, examining the relationship between climate shifts and flora adaptation, had particular urgency, given the accelerating effects of climate change on the delicate ecosystems of the Smokies. Consulting her GPS, Karen confirmed she was approaching her first designated research site of the day. The area was known for its diverse understory vegetation, including several species of interest for her study. She had selected this particular section of the park after poring over topographical maps and previous botanical surveys, identifying it as a promising location for finding the specific Trillium variants she was tracking. The site was approximately 4 miles from the nearest ranger station and 3 miles from where she had parked her weathered Subaru Outback at a small trailhead parking area. As she reached a small clearing beside a bubbling creek, Karen decided this would be her primary work area for the morning. Slipping off her backpack, she methodically began setting up her portable research station. First, she pulled out her field notebook, a waterproof journal filled with meticulous notes and sketches from previous expeditions. Next came her digital camera with macro lens attachments for documenting the minute details of plant specimens, a tablet containing reference materials and data collection forms, collection containers of various sizes, measuring tools, soil testing, equipment, and small flags for marking study plots. Karen took a long drink from her water bottle before beginning her work in earnest. She sectioned off a 10 by 10 meter plot using biodegradable string and stakes, then began the painstaking process of cataloging every plant species within the boundaries. The rich biodiversity of the Smokies never ceased to amaze her. Within just this small area, she had already identified over 30 different species of plants, from the common wood sorrel and various ferns to the more unusual spotted wintergreen and pink ladies' slipper orchids. 2 hours passed quickly as Karen worked, completely absorbed in her methodical documentation. She recorded growth patterns, took soil samples, photographed specimens, and carefully measured leaf sizes and stem heights. The morning sun had risen higher, warming the forest despite the shade, and Karen's stomach began to growl. Glancing at her watch, she realized it was already past 11, time for a lunch break and a check-in with Jason. Reaching for her radio, Karen pressed the talk button. "Jason, it's Karen, just checking in. How's your site looking?" There was a brief crackle of static before Jason's voice came through. "Hey, Dr. Wilson, it's going well. I found 3 of the Trillium variants we were looking for, including one that might be the Trillium sulcatum hybrid you predicted. Taking samples now." Karen smiled at the enthusiasm in her assistant's voice. Jason was a promising doctoral student, meticulous and passionate about the work. "That's excellent news. I'm taking a quick lunch break, then moving on to the secondary site this afternoon. Meet back at the vehicle by 6? Sounds good. I packed extra trail mix if you want some when we meet up. Always prepared, Karen laughed. I'll check in again at 2. Wilson out. Setting the radio aside, Karen reached into her backpack for her lunch container. She had packed a turkey sandwich, an apple, some cheese sticks, and a bag of mixed nuts, enough to fuel her through the afternoon's work. As she unwrapped her sandwich, a rustling sound from the underbrush across the clearing caught her attention. Years of fieldwork had attuned her senses to the normal sounds of the forest, and something about this noise seemed different, heavier, more deliberate than a squirrel or raccoon. Karen froze, sandwich halfway to her mouth, and scanned the edge of the clearing. At first, she saw nothing unusual among the dense rhododendron thickets. Then a movement, a patch of black among the green foliage, followed by the emergence of a rounded, furry ear. Karen's breath caught in her throat as a black bear pushed its way through the underbrush into the clearing, its nose lifted, clearly catching the scent of her lunch. It wasn't an exceptionally large black bear, probably a young adult male. Karen guessed from her wilderness training, standing about 5 feet tall when on its hind legs, which it momentarily did to better survey the clearing. Its glossy black fur shone in the patches of sunlight, and its small eyes fixed immediately on Karen, and more importantly, the food in her hands. Karen's mind raced through the bear safety protocols she had learned and practiced over her years of fieldwork. Don't run, make yourself look bigger, back away slowly, keep food secured. She carefully set her sandwich back in its container and slowly rose to her feet, holding her arms out to appear larger. "Hey bear," she called out firmly, using the authoritative tone recommended by wildlife experts. "Go on now, get out of here." The bear dropped back to all fours, but showed no signs of retreating. Instead, it took a few lumbering steps forward, its nose working continuously as it sniffed the air. Karen knew black bears had an incredible sense of smell, capable of detecting food from over a mile away, and her lunch was an irresistible lure. "I said, get out of here!" Karen shouted louder, clapping her hands together to create a sharp, startling noise. For a moment, the bear paused, seeming to consider this strange human behavior. Then, to Karen's dismay, it continued its approach, now moving with more purpose toward her research station and backpack. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she assessed her options. Her bear spray was in the side pocket of her backpack, which now lay between her and the advancing bear. The trees behind her were too thick for a quick escape, and the creek to her left was shallow but had slippery rocks that could cause a dangerous fall if she attempted to cross it in haste. Her best option seemed to be to continue backing away while trying to scare the bear off. She clapped again and stomped her foot. "Go away, bear!" The animal hesitated briefly, but then continued forward, now just 15 feet from her backpack. Karen knew that once it got into her food, the situation could escalate quickly. Bears that successfully obtained human food often became more aggressive in future encounters, creating dangerous situations for both humans and the bears themselves, which frequently had to be relocated or even euthanized after developing a taste for human provisions. Making a split-second decision, Karen lunged for her backpack, determined to grab her bear spray before the animal reached it. Her sudden movement startled the bear, which huffed loudly and swung its head from side to side, a sign of agitation that Karen recognized too late. As her fingers closed around the canister of spray in the backpack's pocket, the bear charged. The attack happened with stunning speed. One moment Karen was reaching for her spray, and the next 200 pounds of muscle and fur slammed into her side, sending her sprawling onto the rocky ground. Pain exploded across her ribs as she hit the earth, the bear spray flying from her grasp. The bear swatted at her with a powerful paw, its claws raking across her left forearm as she instinctively raised it to protect her face. Karen screamed in pain and terror as she rolled away, desperately trying to put distance between herself and the enraged animal. The bear followed, huffing and making short lunges toward her. She scrambled backward on all fours, her injured arm throbbing intensely. Her heel caught on a protruding root, sending her falling backward. As her head struck a rock on the ground, stars exploded across her vision, momentarily disorienting her. The bear took advantage of her vulnerability, advancing and swatting at her legs with another powerful blow. Karen felt claws tear through her hiking pants and into the flesh of her right thigh. The pain was immediate and searing. Through a haze of fear and shock, she remembered another piece of bear safety advice. If a black bear attacks, fight back with everything you have. With her uninjured arm, Karen grabbed a fallen branch beside her and swung it with all her might at the bear's face. The impact was jarring, sending fresh waves of pain up her arm, but it had the desired effect. The bear backed up a few steps, shaking its head in confusion at this sudden resistance. "Help!" Karen screamed, hoping against hope that Jason or another hiker might be within earshot. "Bear attack, help me!" She swung the branch again to keep the bear at bay, but she could feel her strength waning. Blood soaked the sleeve of her torn field shirt, and her vision swam from the blow to her head. The bear huffed and paced in front of her, seemingly recalculating its approach after meeting resistance. Karen knew she couldn't fight much longer. Her best hope was to keep the bear intimidated enough to lose interest, or to somehow reach the bear spray that had fallen several feet away during the initial attack. She tried to gauge the distance, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, making it difficult to focus. The bear chose that moment to charge again. Karen swung her makeshift weapon weakly, but this time the bear was not deterred. It knocked the branch from her grasp with a powerful swipe and loomed over her. Karen curled into a protective ball, covering her head and neck with her arms, as she had been taught, preparing for the worst. But the attack she expected didn't come. Instead, a sharp crack echoed through the clearing, the sound of a large branch breaking, followed by shouts. Through the haze of pain and fear, Karen heard a familiar voice. "Hey, get away from her!" It was Jason, his voice uncharacteristically commanding as he crashed through the underbrush into the clearing. He was waving his arms wildly and shouting at the top of his lungs. Behind him came two hikers Karen didn't recognize, both men in their 30s, also yelling and making themselves as intimidating as possible. The sudden appearance of three loud humans gave the bear pause. It backed away from Karen, swinging its head between her and the newcomers, as if weighing its options. Jason continued advancing, now banging his hiking poles together to create more noise. One of the hikers picked up a rock and hurled it near the bear, careful not to hit it but creating another startling sound as it crashed through the underbrush. The combination proved effective. With a final huff, the bear turned and lumbered rapidly away, disappearing into the thick forest understory. Karen let out a sob of relief, uncurling from her protective position. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her injured arm and leg, and the world tilted alarmingly around her. "Dr. Wilson." Jason was at her side in an instant, his face pale with shock as he took in her bloodied condition. "Oh my God, are you okay? What happened?" "Bear," Karen managed to rasp, her throat raw from screaming. "It wanted my lunch. I tried to scare it away." The two hikers approached cautiously, scanning the forest edge for any sign of the bear's return. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a red beard, knelt beside Karen and Jason. "I'm Mike. That's my brother Dave. We're both wilderness first responders. Can we help?" Jason nodded gratefully, still looking shell-shocked. "Please, I have a first aid kit in my pack." As Jason fumbled for his supplies, Mike carefully examined Karen's injuries. "Mom, I need to check how bad these wounds are. Is that okay?" Karen nodded weakly, wincing as Mike gently examined her lacerated forearm. The sleeve of her shirt was torn and soaked with blood, revealing 4 deep gashes where the bear's claws had connected. "These are deep, but the bleeding is slowing. Definitely need proper medical attention, though." He moved to her leg, where her hiking pants were similarly shredded. "This one's not quite as deep, but still serious. And you hit your head?" "Yes," Karen confirmed, fighting against a wave of nausea. "Rock, when I fell." Dave had been keeping watch, but now approached with a water bottle. "She needs to drink if she can. Shock and blood loss, dehydration will make it worse." Mike nodded in agreement as Jason returned with the first aid kit. Working together, the 3 men cleaned Karen's wounds as best they could with the available supplies, then wrapped them in sterile bandages. Karen bit her lip against the pain, but remained conscious throughout the process, which she took as a good sign despite her dizziness. "We need to get her to a hospital," Mike said decisively, once they had stabilized her injuries. "How far are we from the trailhead?" "About 3 miles, Jason replied, his voice steadier now that he had a concrete task to focus on. "But my car is there, I can drive her to the emergency room in Gatlinburg once we make it out." "Can you walk at all?" Dave asked Karen gently. Karen tried to push herself up, but immediately felt lightheaded. "I don't think so. Too dizzy." The men exchanged glances. "We'll have to carry her," Mike concluded. "Dave and I can make a stretcher with some branches in our jackets. Meanwhile, is there someone we should contact? Park rangers?" Jason nodded and pulled out his radio. "I'll call it in. The nearest ranger station is about 4 miles west of here." While Jason made the call and the brothers constructed a makeshift stretcher, Karen fought to stay conscious. The initial shock was wearing off, leaving her in considerable pain from her injuries. Her thoughts were muddled from the concussion, but she worried about what would happen to the bear. Despite her trauma, the scientist in her recognized that the animal had only been following its natural instincts. It wasn't malicious, just a wild creature attracted by the smell of food. "Jason," she called weakly. Her assistant immediately abandoned his radio call and rushed to her side. "What is it? Are you okay?" "The bear. Tell them it was just being a bear, not aggressive until I moved suddenly. My fault." Jason looked bewildered. "Dr. Wilson, that bear attacked you. You could have been killed. Promise me," Karen insisted, gripping his wrist with her uninjured hand. "Don't let them hunt it down. Important for ecosystem." Jason's expression softened with understanding. Even injured and in shock, his mentor was still thinking like an ecologist. "I'll tell them, but right now we need to focus on getting you help." The stretcher was completed quickly, a sturdy frame of branches with the hiker's jackets lashed across it using cord from Jason's pack. As carefully as possible, the three men lifted Karen onto it, causing her to gasp as fresh pain shot through her injuries. "Sorry," Mike murmured. "We'll try to keep it as smooth as possible, but the trail is rough in places." The journey back to the trailhead was a blur of pain and disjointed observations for Karen. She drifted in and out of full awareness, sometimes focusing with strange clarity on tiny details, the pattern of leaves overhead, the sound of a woodpecker in the distance, the labored breathing of her rescuers as they navigated the difficult terrain, before slipping back into a foggy state where time seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably. They had been hiking for what seemed like hours, but was probably less than one when a new voice joined their group. Karen opened her eyes to see a uniformed park ranger walking alongside the stretcher, his face grim as he assessed her condition. "Ma'am, I'm Ranger Thompson. Help is coming. We've got a medical team meeting us at the trailhead. Just hang in." "There." Karen tried to respond but found she lacked the energy. The ranger turned his attention to Jason, asking for details about the attack. Through her mental fog, Karen heard her assistant explaining what had happened, careful to emphasize, as she had requested, that the bear had only attacked after being startled, and that it had fled as soon as help arrived. "Sounds like a typical food-motivated encounter that escalated," the ranger commented. "We'll follow protocols, but if it's an otherwise unblemished bear with no history of aggression, relocation would be the standard approach, not euthanasia." Karen felt a wave of relief at those words, allowing herself to relax slightly for the first time since the attack. Her research and the park's wildlife were so deeply intertwined in her mind that even in her injured state she couldn't separate her concern for one from the other. As they neared the trailhead, more voices joined the procession. Emergency medical technicians took over from the exhausted hikers and Jason, transferring Karen from the makeshift stretcher to a proper one with practiced efficiency. She felt the sharp sting of an IV needle in her uninjured arm and the blessed relief of pain medication beginning to course through her system. "Dr. Wilson, we're taking you to LeConte Medical Center in Sevierville," a female EMT informed her. As they loaded her into the waiting ambulance, "It's about a 30-minute drive. Your wounds need proper cleaning and stitching, and we need to assess that head injury." Karen managed a weak nod. "My research, equipment, I'll take care of everything," Jason assured her, appearing at her side before the ambulance doors closed. "Your samples, your data, your car. Don't worry about anything except getting better." "Thank you," Karen whispered, suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude for her dedicated assistant. The hikers, Mike and Dave, are giving their contact information to the ranger for the incident report. They said they'll check in on you at the hospital later if that's okay. Before Karen could respond, another EMT gently interrupted. "We need to go now. Are you family?" he asked Jason. "No, just her research assistant. Her emergency contact is her sister in Knoxville. Her information should be in Dr. Wilson's phone." The EMT nodded. "We'll make that call from the hospital. You can follow in your vehicle if you want." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began to move, Karen closed her eyes, allowing the medication to dull the edges of her pain. The events of the past hour replayed fragmentally in her mind. The bear's sudden appearance, the terror of the attack, the fortuitous arrival of Jason and the hikers. She had been researching in these mountains for nearly 20 years without a serious incident. One moment of inattention, one split-second decision to reach for her backpack instead of continuing to back away, had resulted in this. The ambulance bounced over a rough section of road, sending a jolt of pain through Karen's injuries despite the medication. She heard the EMT apologize, felt the cool pressure of a blood pressure cuff around her uninjured arm, registered the beeping of monitoring equipment, but it all seemed distant, happening to someone else. The concussion and the shock of the attack left her strangely detached, floating above the immediacy of her situation. By the time they reached LeConte Medical Center, Karen had surrendered to this detachment, answering questions mechanically, when asked, but otherwise drifting in a semi-conscious state that protected her from the worst of the pain and fear. The emergency room was a flurry of activity, as she was transferred from the ambulance stretcher to a hospital bed, surrounded by medical personnel who worked with practiced efficiency to assess and treat her injuries. "Dr. Wilson, can you hear me?" A young doctor leaned over her, his face serious but kind. "I'm Dr. Patel. You've sustained some significant lacerations from a bear attack, as well as a concussion from your fall. We're going to clean and suture your wounds, give you antibiotics to prevent infection, and monitor you overnight for any complications from the head injury. Do you understand?" "Yes," Karen murmured, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "How bad?" "The forearm lacerations are the most severe. They'll require several layers of sutures, and there may be some minor muscle damage, but with proper care and physical therapy, we expect a full recovery. The leg wounds are less deep but still significant. As for the concussion, the initial assessment is encouraging, but we'll know more after we run some scans." Karen tried to nod, but winced as the movement sent daggers of pain through her skull. "Bear, is it okay?" Dr. Patel looked momentarily confused by the question, before understanding dawned. "You're concerned about the bear. That's admirable, given the circumstances. I don't have any information about that, but perhaps the park rangers can update you once you're stabilized." The next few hours passed in a blur of procedures. Wound cleaning that stung despite the local anesthesia, the strange tugging sensation of sutures being placed, the claustrophobic tunnel of the CT scanner as they assessed her head injury, the constant parade of medical personnel checking her vital signs and neurological responses. At some point, Karen became aware that her sister Maggie had arrived and was sitting beside her bed, her normally animated face drawn with worry. "You always have to one-up me, don't you?" Maggie said with forced lightness when she noticed Karen was awake. "I sprained my ankle hiking last year, so you have to go and get attacked by a bear." Despite her pain and exhaustion, Karen managed a weak smile. "Go big or go home." Maggie's attempt at humor crumbled, and she gripped Karen's uninjured hand tightly. "God, Karen, when the hospital called, I thought—" She swallowed hard. "Mom and Dad are on their way from Florida. Should be here tomorrow morning." "Don't. I need to make a fuss," Karen protested weakly, but she was secretly relieved that her family would be there. The reality of how close she had come to a much worse outcome was beginning to sink in, bringing with it a delayed emotional response that threatened to overwhelm her medicated calm. "Too late," Maggie replied, attempting another smile. "The Wilson clan is mobilizing. Even Aunt Judy is threatening to fly in from Arizona." Karen groaned theatrically, which made her sister laugh, a welcome moment of normalcy amid the sterile hospital environment and the gravity of the situation. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patel, accompanied by a uniformed park ranger, a different one from the trail, this one an older woman with short gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades outdoors. "Dr. Wilson, this is Chief Ranger Martinez from Great Smoky Mountains National Park," Dr. Patel introduced. "She'd like to ask you a few questions about the incident if you're feeling up to it." Karen nodded carefully, mindful of her concussion. "I can talk." The Chief Ranger approached the bed, her expression professional but compassionate. "Dr. Wilson, I'm sorry about what happened today. I understand from your assistant that you're a botany professor conducting research in the park. Yes, climate change effect on Appalachian flora, permitted research. We have your permits on file," the ranger assured her. "I need to ask you some questions about the bear encounter to complete our incident report and determine appropriate action regarding the animal. Is that all right?" For the next 20 minutes, Karen recounted the events leading up to and during the attack as clearly as her concussed state would allow. The ranger listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing Karen to tell the story at her own pace. When Karen described how she had lunged for her backpack, triggering the bear's charge, Ranger Martinez nodded knowingly. That's consistent with typical black bear behavior. They generally avoid confrontation unless they feel threatened or cornered. The sudden movement likely triggered a defensive response. She made a note in her report. "And you mentioned the bear fled as soon as additional people arrived?" "Yes, didn't want to fight, just wanted food, I think." The ranger nodded again. "Based on your description and the location, we believe this was likely a young male bear we've been tracking in that area. No previous incidents of aggression. Though there have been a few reports of it being spotted near trails, your experience, while unfortunate, is actually quite valuable data for our wildlife management efforts. What will happen to the bear? Karen asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind since the attack. Standard protocol for a first-time offense with clear food motivation would be monitoring rather than removal, especially given that it retreated when challenged. We'll increase patrols in that area, post additional warning signs about bear activity, and possibly set up cameras to track its movements. If it shows escalating behaviors or returns to the attack site repeatedly, we might consider relocation. But euthanasia would be a last resort, only if it demonstrated unusual aggression in multiple encounters. Karen felt relief wash over her. Thank you, important for ecosystem balance. The ranger's professional demeanor softened slightly. 20 years in wildlife management, and it still surprises me when someone who's just been mauled advocates for the animal that did it. Your assistant mentioned you were concerned about this immediately after the attack. Just doing what bears do, Karen replied simply. My mistake, as much as his. After collecting a few more details for her report, Ranger Martinez prepared to leave. I'll be in touch with any updates about the bear situation. In the meantime, focus on your recovery. The park will work with your university regarding your research permits and accommodations for completing your work once you're healed. The ranger departed. Dr. Patel stepped forward to check Karen's vitals and the dressings on her wounds. We'll be moving you to a regular room soon for overnight observation. The CT scan showed a mild concussion, but no bleeding or serious brain injury. You were lucky. Lucky wasn't exactly how Karen felt at the moment, with her arm and leg throbbing despite the pain medication, her head pounding, and the knowledge that her carefully planned research schedule was now completely derailed. But the doctor was right. The attack could have ended much worse. Black bears rarely killed humans, but serious maulings did occur, particularly when food was involved or when the bear felt threatened, as had happened in her case. Once settled in her hospital room for the night, with Maggie dozing in the uncomfortable visitor's chair beside her, Karen found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion and medication. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the bear charging toward her, felt the impact of its weight slamming into her body, the searing pain of claws tearing through skin and muscle. The rational part of her brain, the scientist who understood animal behavior and ecosystem dynamics, could contextualize the attack as a natural, if unfortunate, interaction between human and wildlife. But another part, the primal human who had experienced genuine terror and pain, kept replaying the traumatic event in vivid detail. She was still awake when a nurse came to check her vital signs at 2 a.m., earning a concerned look. Can't sleep, the nurse asked sympathetically as she recorded Karen's elevated heart rate and blood pressure. Every time I close my eyes. Karen didn't need to finish the sentence. The nurse nodded, with understanding. That's common after a traumatic event. I'll ask the doctor if we can give you something mild to help you rest. Sleep is an important part of healing, both physically and mentally. When the nurse returned with a small pill that she promised would just take the edge off, Karen accepted it gratefully. As the medication gradually took effect, Karen's thoughts became less linear, drifting between the events of the day and disconnected memories of other wilderness encounters throughout her career. The time she nearly stepped on a copperhead while photographing rare orchids in Tennessee, the curious young raccoon that had once followed her for nearly a mile along a research transect, the majestic bull elk she had observed from a safe distance in Cataloochee Valley. In all her years of fieldwork, she had always respected the boundary between observer and wildlife, understanding that she was a visitor in their habitat. Today, that boundary had been breached in the most visceral way possible. As she finally drifted towards sleep, one image remained clear in her mind: the bear disappearing into the forest after being driven away by Jason and the hikers, moving, with the fluid grace that belied its power, back to the wilderness where it belonged. There was something fitting about that being her last clear memory of the encounter, the natural order restored, each creature returning to its proper place in the ecosystem. Her last conscious thought before succumbing to medicated sleep was a hope that both she and the bear would be able to continue their respective roles in the mountains she loved. Morning arrived with the controlled chaos of a hospital shift change, new nurses introducing themselves, breakfast trays being delivered, Dr. Patel stopping by with a team of residents trailing behind him like ducklings following their mother. Karen felt groggy from the sleeping medication, but more clear-headed than the previous evening, the fog of concussion beginning to lift. "How are you feeling this morning?" Dr. Patel asked as he examined the sutured wounds on her arm and leg. "Like, I got hit by a truck," Karen admitted, "but more coherent." The doctor nodded, seemingly satisfied with what he saw. "The wounds look good. No signs of infection starting. These dressings will need to be changed daily for the first week. The sutures in your arm will need to stay in for about 14 days, the ones in your leg for 10. You'll need to follow up with your primary care physician for suture removal and wound checks." He stepped back, making notes in her chart. "As for the concussion, your neurological checks through the night were reassuring. I'd like to do one more set of scans before discharge, but assuming those come back clear, you should be able to go home today with appropriate precautions and care instructions." "Home?" Maggie interjected from where she'd been quietly listening by the window. "She lives alone in a second-floor apartment with no elevator. She can barely walk." "I'll be fine," Karen protested weakly, though the thought of navigating her apartment building stairs with her injured leg was admittedly daunting. Dr. Patel looked between the sisters. "She will need assistance for at least the first few days, especially with the concussion. Ideally, someone should be with her for monitoring." "She's staying with me," Maggie stated firmly, in a tone that Karen recognized from childhood as her sister's non-negotiable voice. "I have a guest room on the first floor and my husband can help if she needs lifting or anything." Karen wanted to object to being discussed as if she weren't present, but truth be told, she was relieved by Maggie's offer. The thought of being alone with her injuries and the fresh psychological trauma of the attack was more unsettling than she wanted to admit. "That sounds like an excellent arrangement," Dr. Patel approved. "I'll have our discharge team provide detailed care instructions for both of you." The door to the hospital room opened then, admitting Karen and Maggie's parents, looking tired from their overnight drive from their retirement community in Florida, but determined to put on brave faces for their injured daughter. "My God, Karen," her father, Richard Wilson, exclaimed as he took in the bandages and bruising. A retired Forestry Service employee himself, he had always worried about his daughter's solitary fieldwork. "When your sister called, 'I'm okay, Dad,' Karen assured him, managing a small smile. "Just some scrapes and a bump on the head." "Bear attacks are hardly just some scrapes," her mother Ellen contradicted, rushing to Karen's bedside to examine her injuries with the critical eye of a former nurse. "Maggie said you needed dozens of stitches. 37 in the arm, 22 in the leg," Karen admitted. "But it could have been much worse. I got lucky." "Lucky would have been no." "Tibber at all," her father grumbled, but he squeezed her hand gently, careful to avoid the IV line. The family reunion was interrupted by the arrival of Jason, looking as though he hadn't slept much, carrying a small potted plant, a pink lady's slipper orchid in a decorative container. "Dr. Wilson, you're awake. How are you feeling?" He handed the plant to her mother while he greeted Karen's parents. "I'm Jason Chen, Dr. Wilson's research assistant. I brought this from the department. Everyone sends their best wishes for a quick recovery." Karen introduced Jason to her parents, who thanked him profusely for his role in rescuing their daughter. Jason deflected the praise, insisting that Mike and Dave, the hiking brothers, deserved most of the credit. "Speaking of," Jason added, "they called this morning to check on you. They're leaving the park today but wanted to make sure you were okay before they continued their trip." "That's very kind," Karen replied, making a mental note to find a way to properly thank the brothers once she was recovered. Without their timely intervention, her encounter with the bear might have had a very different outcome. "I also wanted to update you on the research situation," Jason continued, shifting into his professional mode. "I've spoken with Department Chair Dr. Ramsey. She sends her best wishes and says to take all the time you need to recover. She's authorized me to continue collecting the basic field data according to your protocols, with guidance via phone or email when needed. The summer research assistants can help with the more straightforward tasks." Karen felt a rush of gratitude for her department's support and Jason's initiative. "Thank you. That's a relief. There's a detailed collection protocol document on my office computer. Password is the usual department one, then my personal folder is protected with Trillium 12, the year I got tenure." Jason diligently noted this information. "I'll access it today. Also, I've secured all your research equipment and samples from yesterday. The Rangers helped me retrieve everything after they took their incident photos. The only casualties were your lunch and backpack, which, the bear got into after. We evacuated you." Karen couldn't help but laugh at this, then winced as the movement pulled at her stitches. "So, he got my sandwich after all. Persistent fellow." Jason smiled, relieved to see his mentor's sense of humor intact. "One more thing. Mike and Dave, the hikers, took some photos right after they scared the bear away. They weren't sure if you'd want them given the circumstances, but thought they might be important for documentation or, I don't know, processing what happened. He held out his phone, showing Karen a series of images. The first few showed her looking alarmingly pale and bloodied on the forest floor, surrounded by her rescuers administering first aid. But it was the last image that caught and held her attention, a somewhat blurry shot of the bear as it retreated into the forest, looking back over its shoulder, with what almost appeared to be a mixture of confusion and wariness. "Can you send me that last one?" Karen asked, surprising everyone in the room. Jason looked uncertain. "The bear, really? Yes, it's a good reminder of why we have safety protocols. And," she paused, trying to articulate a feeling she didn't fully understand herself. "I don't know, it feels important to remember that it was just being a bear, not a monster." Her father shook his head in bewilderment. "Only my daughter would want a souvenir photo of the animal that nearly killed her." "That's our Karen," Maggie agreed with a sigh, more concerned about the wildlife than herself. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a hospital orderly to take Karen for her final scans before discharge. The tests confirmed what Dr. Patel had suspected, a mild concussion with no evidence of intracranial bleeding or serious brain injury. By early afternoon, Karen found herself being wheeled out of the hospital's main entrance, prescriptions for antibiotics and pain management in hand, detailed wound care instructions explained to both her and Maggie, and strict orders to follow up with her primary care physician in 3 days. The transition from hospital to Maggie's suburban Knoxville home was physically painful for Karen, despite the medication. Every bump in the road on the 40-minute drive sent jolts of discomfort through her injured limbs, and the process of getting from the car to the guest bedroom left her exhausted and sweating, despite the assistance of her father and brother-in-law. Once settled in Maggie's comfortable guest room, surrounded by family and with the promise of her sister's excellent cooking for dinner, Karen finally allowed herself to acknowledge the full magnitude of what had happened. The attack itself had lasted perhaps 2 minutes at most, but in that brief span, her entire relationship with the wilderness she had dedicated her life to studying had been fundamentally altered. She didn't yet know if the change was permanent or temporary, if her passion for fieldwork would recover along with her physical injuries, or if something essential had been lost in that violent encounter. "Penny for your thoughts," her mother said softly, interrupting Karen's introspection as she placed a cup of herbal tea on the bedside table. Karen attempted a smile. "Just wondering what this means for my research, for my career." Ellen Wilson sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "One step at a time, dear. Heal first, then decide. But if I know my daughter, you'll be back in those mountains as soon as these stitches are out." "I don't know, Mom," Karen admitted, voicing the fear that had been growing since the attack. "I've never been afraid out there before. Not really. Cautious, yes. Respectful of the dangers, absolutely, but not afraid. Now you've had a frightening experience that will take time to process," her mother finished for her. "That's normal and healthy. The fear might not go away completely, but you'll learn to work with it, not against it, and maybe it will make you even more careful in the future." Karen nodded, grateful for her mother's practical wisdom. The conversation shifted to lighter topics: family gossip, plans for Karen's recovery period, her parents' recent cruise to Alaska, but the question of her future relationship with fieldwork lingered in the back of her mind throughout the evening. That night, despite her exhaustion and medication, Karen's sleep was troubled by vivid dreams of her encounter with the bear. In some versions, Jason and the hikers never arrived, and the attack continued to its grim conclusion. In others, she managed to reach her bear spray in time, driving the animal away before any contact was made. The most disturbing dreams were the ones where she found herself transformed into the bear, experiencing the encounter from the animal's perspective, the enticing smell of human food, the confusion at the loud noises and threatening postures, the instinctive response to perceived danger. She woke shortly after dawn, disoriented and in pain, as her medication had worn off during the night. As she reached for the pills and water Maggie had left on the nightstand, Karen noticed her phone blinking with notifications. Among the expected messages from concerned colleagues and friends was an email from Ranger Martinez with the subject, "Line Bear Incident Follow-Up." Opening it, Karen read, "Dr. Wilson, I wanted to update you on the situation regarding the bear involved in yesterday's incident. Based on your account and our assessment of the animal's behavior, we have classified this as a defensive, food-motivated attack rather than predatory aggression. As such, our management response will focus on increased visitor education and awareness rather than removal of the animal. We have posted additional warning signs in the area of your research site and will be conducting extra patrols through the region for the next few weeks. One of our wildlife biologists suggested that this might be a teaching opportunity. We're developing additional materials for our visitor centers about proper food storage and bear safety, using your experience, anonymized, of course, as a case study. I hope your recovery is progressing well. If you're amenable, we would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you further once you're feeling better, as your scientific perspective on the encounter could be valuable for our educational initiatives. Regards, Chief Ranger Elena Martinez. Great. Smoky Mountains National Park. Karen felt a surprising surge of emotion as she read the email. Relief that the bear would not be euthanized, certainly, but also something more complex, a sense of purpose emerging from her trauma. If her experience could help prevent similar incidents in the future, perhaps some meaning could be salvaged from the painful encounter. She typed a brief reply with her uninjured hand, thanking the ranger for the update and expressing her willingness to contribute to the educational materials once she was further along in her recovery. As she pressed send, Karen realized that this might be the first step in reclaiming her relationship with the wilderness, not by pretending the attack hadn't happened or that it hadn't affected her, but by integrating the experience into her understanding of what it meant to work in wild places. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by her recovery needs. Mornings began with medication and wound care, Maggie carefully cleaning and rebandaging the sutured gashes with a gentle precision that reminded Karen of their mother's nursing background. Afternoons often included short, careful walks around Maggie's neighborhood, gradually increasing in distance as Karen's strength returned and her injuries began to heal. Her parents stayed for 3 days before reluctantly returning to Florida, extracting promises from both sisters that they would call daily with updates. A week after the attack, Karen sat on Maggie's back porch, her injured leg elevated on a cushioned footstool, coordinating research activities with Jason via video call on her tablet. The Trillium erectum population in Quadrat 3 is showing the same pattern we observed last year, Jason reported, panning his camera to show a cluster of deep red flowers nestled among the forest understory. But the hybrid variants seem to be expanding their range. I've marked the new locations on the GPS map. Karen leaned closer to the screen, her scientific curiosity momentarily overshadowing the lingering discomfort of her injuries. That's consistent with the adaptation hypothesis. Can you collect tissue samples from both the standard and hybrid populations? We need to compare gene expression patterns. Already done, Jason confirmed. I followed the protocol from your document exactly. The samples are properly preserved and labeled in the department's freezer. They continued discussing research logistics for another 30 minutes before Jason hesitantly broached a different subject. Dr. Wilson, the department has been asking when you might return to teaching. The summer session starts in 3 weeks, and you're scheduled for the field botany course. Karen sighed, running her fingers through her hair, a habitual gesture when she was thinking, though now complicated by the stitches in her forearm. I should be physically capable by then, at least for the classroom portions, the field components. She paused, considering. I'll need a co-instructor for those, at least initially. Would you be interested? Jason's face lit up. Absolutely. I mean, I was planning to TA for the course anyway, but I'd be honored to help with the field sessions. It's settled then. I'll email Dr. Ramsey today to confirm. Karen hesitated before adding, and Jason, thank you, not just for continuing the research, but for, well, everything. The young man looked momentarily embarrassed by the gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. Perhaps, Karen acknowledged, but it was you who did it. I haven't forgotten that. After ending the call, Karen sat quietly watching the birds at Maggie's feeders, contemplating her tentative decision to return to teaching and by extension to fieldwork. The physical wounds were healing well. Her follow-up appointment showed no signs of infection, and the concussion symptoms had mostly resolved. The psychological wounds were more complex. She still had nightmares about the attack, still found herself flinching at unexpected movements in her peripheral vision, still felt a flutter of anxiety when contemplating a return to the forests where she had always felt at home. Yet alongside the fear was a growing determination not to let one traumatic experience define the rest of her career. The wilderness had been her laboratory, her classroom, and her sanctuary for most of her adult life. The bear attack had shattered the illusion of safety she had unconsciously maintained, despite her knowledge of the risks, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. A renewed respect for the power and unpredictability of nature might make her a more cautious, more prepared, and ultimately more effective field researcher. 2 weeks after the attack, Karen returned to her apartment despite Maggie's protests that it was too soon. Her sister's care had been invaluable during the initial recovery, but Karen found herself craving independence and the comfort of her own space. The second-floor stairs remained a challenge with her healing leg, but a slower, more deliberate approach made them manageable. Her first night alone was difficult. Every creak of the building, every rustle of leaves outside her window seemed magnified, triggering flashes of memory from the attack. Karen combated the anxiety with practiced mindfulness techniques and by immersing herself in work, reviewing the data Jason had collected and drafting an adjustment to her research timeline to accommodate her recovery period. The following morning, Karen made a significant decision. Opening her laptop, she navigated to the website for Great Smoky Mountains National Park and located the contact information for the ranger station nearest to her research site. After a moment's hesitation, she dialed the number. Sugarlands. Visitor Center. Ranger Wilson speaking. How can I help you today? Hello, this is Dr. Karen Wilson from the University of Tennessee. I was involved in a bear incident in the park 2 weeks ago, and I spoke with Chief Ranger Martinez afterward. I'm calling to follow up on something she mentioned in an email. There was a brief pause as the ranger presumably checked records. Ah, yes, Dr. Wilson. The chief mentioned you might be in touch. How are you recovering? Better every day, thank you. In her email, Ranger Martinez mentioned the possibility of my contributing to some educational materials about bear safety. I'd like to offer my assistance with that project. The conversation that followed was productive, with the ranger connecting Karen to the park's education coordinator. By the end of the call, plans were in place for Karen to collaborate on a new interpretive display for the visitor center, focusing on researchers' safety in bear country, as well as potentially participating in a ranger-led program later in the summer once she was fully recovered. As she hung up, Karen felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since the attack. By transforming her traumatic experience into an educational opportunity, she could help others avoid similar encounters while also processing her own complex feelings about the incident. It wouldn't erase the scars, both physical and psychological, but it would give them meaning. 3 weeks after the attack, the day Karen had been both anticipating and dreading arrived, her return to her research site in the park. Dr. Patel had cleared her for light field activities, though with strict limitations on weight-bearing and exertion. The sutures had been removed from both wounds, leaving angry red lines that would eventually fade to silvery scars, permanent reminders of her encounter with the wilderness at its most raw. Jason drove them to the trailhead in his weathered Jeep, casting concerned glances at Karen throughout the journey. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching the familiar landscape of the Smokies pass by outside the window. The morning was similar to the day of the attack: clear blue skies, the fresh green of early summer foliage, the mountains rising majestically in the distance, yet everything felt different through the lens of her experience. "We don't have to do this today," Jason offered as he parked at the small lot near the trailhead. "The research can wait another week if you're not ready." Karen shook her head firmly. "No, it needs to be today. If I wait until I feel completely ready, I might never return." She offered a small smile. "Besides, we have company this time." As if on cue, a park service vehicle pulled into the lot beside them. Ranger Martinez stepped out, accompanied by a younger male ranger carrying standard issue gear, including prominently displayed bear spray. "Dr. Wilson," the chief ranger greeted her warmly. "It's good to finally meet in person under better circumstances. This is Ranger Diaz. He'll be accompanying you to your research site today." "I appreciate the escort," Karen replied, meaning it sincerely. The Park Service had no obligation to provide personnel for her research expedition, but they had readily agreed when she requested the accompaniment for her first return to the site. "Standard protocol after a significant wildlife incident," Ranger Martinez assured her. "Plus, it gives us an opportunity to verify that the additional warning signs have been properly placed." The hike to the research site was deliberately slow, accommodating Karen's still healing injuries and allowing her time to acclimate to being back on the trail. Jason carried most of the equipment, while Karen managed only her field notebook and a small camera. Ranger Diaz led the way, maintaining a vigilant watch for wildlife while his superior and Karen discussed the educational materials they were developing together. "We've drafted the initial content for the display," Ranger Martinez explained as they walked. "It emphasizes proper food storage, bear recognition signals, and appropriate response techniques. We'd like you to review it for accuracy from a researcher's perspective and perhaps contribute a brief account of your experience if you're comfortable doing that. I think I would be, Karen said after a moment's consideration. It might help others and, she hesitated, it might help me too. As they approached the clearing where the attack had occurred, Karen felt her heart rate increase. Her palms grow damp with sweat. The rational part of her brain knew that the statistical likelihood of another bear encounter in the same location was minimal, especially with 3 other people present and all of them carrying bear spray. But trauma doesn't always respond to rational thought. Ranger Diaz noticed her hesitation and paused. We can approach from a different angle if that would be easier. Karen took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. No, I need to see it exactly as it was. They continued forward, emerging into the now familiar clearing beside the small creek. Karen stood motionless for a long moment, absorbing the scene. It looked so ordinary, so peaceful. Wildflowers, nodding in the gentle breeze, the creek burbling over smooth stones, sunlight dappling the forest floor through the canopy overhead. There was no visible evidence of the violent encounter that had taken place here 3 weeks earlier. Nature had absorbed the event and continued its timeless cycles, indifferent to the human drama that had briefly interrupted its rhythm. This is where it happened, Karen said quietly, more to herself than to her companions. She pointed to a spot near the creek. I was setting up my research station there. The bear came from that direction through the rhododendron thicket. Jason and the rangers remained respectfully silent, allowing Karen to navigate the space and her memories at her own pace. She walked slowly around the clearing, noting the fresh warning sign the Park Service had installed at its edge, then stopped at the exact location where she had been standing when the bear charged. Something caught her eye, a small splash of color partially hidden beneath a fallen leaf. Carefully, Karen crouched down, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her healing leg wound, and picked up a small plastic sample container that had been overlooked during the cleanup after the attack. It was one of hers, labeled in her distinctive handwriting, Trillium erectum variant, Site 4B. The small object connecting her past and present work in this place sparked an unexpected emotional response. Karen found tears welling in her eyes, not from fear or trauma, but from a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. She had survived, she was healing, and she was back, facing her fears and reclaiming her place. In this ecosystem, she had dedicated her career to understanding. Dr. Wilson, are you okay? Jason asked, concerned by her prolonged silence and the visible emotion on her face. Karen straightened up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand and pocketing the small container. Yes, better than okay, actually. She took a deep breath of the mountain air, letting it fill her lungs and ground her in the present moment. Let's get to work. For the next 3 hours, the group established a new research plot several yards from the original site. Karen directed the process, her scientific focus gradually overshadowing the emotional weight of the return. Jason efficiently set up the equipment and began collecting samples according to their established protocols, while the rangers maintained a watchful perimeter, occasionally consulting with Karen about bear activity patterns in the area. By early afternoon, they had completed the essential data collection for this site. As they packed up the equipment, Ranger Martinez approached Karen with a question that had clearly been on her mind throughout the day. How are you feeling about being back here? Really? Karen considered the question honestly before answering. It's complicated. There's still fear, especially when I hear unexpected sounds in the underbrush. I don't think that will ever completely disappear, but there's also a strange sense of completion, of coming full circle, and underneath it all there's still the same love for this place that brought me here in the first place. The ranger nodded with understanding. The wilderness demands respect. Sometimes it teaches that lesson more harshly than others, but the people who truly belong here find their way back, changed but not deterred. As they hiked back toward the trailhead, Karen found herself scanning the forest more vigilantly than she had before the attack, more aware of potential hiding places, more attentive to signs of wildlife, not with paralyzing fear, but with a heightened awareness that felt like a natural evolution of her relationship with this environment. Near the end of the trail, the group paused for a water break in a small opening among the trees. As Karen took a long drink from her water bottle, her gaze swept across the forest edge, a habitual scan that had become more deliberate since the attack. She froze, the bottle halfway to her lips, as her eyes locked on a familiar shape partially, visible behind a large oak about 50 yards away. A black bear stood perfectly still, watching their group with evident curiosity. It was impossible to know if it was the same animal involved in the attack. Black bears were notoriously difficult to distinguish from one another without radio collars or distinctive markings, but something about its size and posture struck Karen as familiar. "Bear," she said quietly, alerting the others without making sudden movements. 2 o'clock behind the large oak. Both rangers immediately assumed position between the bear and the researchers, hands moving to their bear spray canisters, but not deploying them as the animal showed no signs of aggression. Jason stepped closer to Karen, his body language protective. "Do you think it's the same one?" he whispered. "I don't know," Karen admitted. "Maybe." For a long, suspended moment, human and bear regarded each other across the intervening space, a tableau of mutual assessment. Karen felt her pulse quicken, but the paralyzing fear she had expected did not materialize. Instead, she experienced a profound sense of connection to the wild creature and to the natural world it represented, a world of beauty and danger inextricably intertwined, a world she had chosen to make the focus of her life's work, despite its risks. Ranger Diaz made a sharp noise and took a step forward. The bear considered this development for a moment, then turned unhurriedly and ambled away into the forest, disappearing among the trees as smoothly as it had appeared. "Was that necessary?" Karen asked, a hint of disappointment in her voice. "Standard protocol," Ranger Martinez replied, though her tone suggested she understood Karen's reaction. "We don't want bears becoming habituated to human presence. A healthy fear of humans keeps them safer in the long run." Karen nodded, recognizing the wisdom in the approach, even as she felt a twinge of regret at the ended encounter. The bear had shown no aggression, no interest in their food, just a natural curiosity about the strange two-legged creatures in its territory. In its departure, Karen saw not the terrifying attacker of her nightmares, but simply a wild animal following its instincts, navigating a world increasingly shaped by human presence. As they resumed their hike back to the trailhead, Karen found herself reflecting on the journey of the past 3 weeks, from victim to survivor, to someone newly calibrated, to the realities of working in wild places. The fear remained, a shadow at the edges of her consciousness that would likely never completely disappear. But alongside it had grown something else, a deeper appreciation for the privilege of moving through these ancient mountains, of studying their secrets, of being permitted a glimpse into a world that existed long before humans and would continue long after they were gone. The physical scars would fade with time, becoming silvery reminders rather than angry red declarations of trauma. The psychological scars would similarly transform, not disappearing but becoming integrated into her understanding of herself and her place in the natural world. The bear, too, would continue its life in these mountains, perhaps remembering the strange encounter with the human, or perhaps forgetting it entirely as it focused on the more immediate concerns of survival. Back at the trailhead parking lot, as they loaded equipment into the vehicles and prepared to go their separate ways, Chief Ranger Martinez handed Karen a small package. "What's this?" Karen asked, surprised by the unexpected gift. "Just a little something to commemorate your return to the field," the ranger replied with a smile. "Open it when you get home." Later that evening, sitting on the small balcony of her apartment, with a cup of herbal tea, Karen finally opened the package. Inside was a beautifully crafted Junior Ranger badge, the kind normally given to children who completed educational activities in the park, modified with a small addition. Beneath the standard Junior Ranger text, someone had carefully engraved the words, "Bear Survivor." Karen laughed aloud at the unexpected humor of the gift, the sound carrying across her neighborhood in the gathering twilight. The laughter felt cleansing, releasing tension she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Tomorrow would bring more healing, more research, more steps toward whatever new normal awaited her. But tonight, with the modified badge pinned to her, field vest hanging by the door, Karen felt a sense of completion. The story of her bear encounter would always be part of her narrative now, not defining her but informing her relationship with the wilderness in ways both challenging and enriching. As darkness fell over Knoxville, in the mountains to the east, a black bear moved through the nighttime forest, following ancient pathways known only to its kind. Perhaps it was the same bear that had attacked Karen, perhaps not. But in either case, it was simply being what it was meant to be. Wild creature in a wild place, a necessary piece in the complex puzzle of an ecosystem Karen had devoted her life to understanding. And in that understanding lay not just scientific knowledge, but a profound acceptance of both the beauty and the danger inherent in the natural world, an acceptance that would guide Karen's work in the mountains for years to come, carrying, The memory of those few violent moments not as a burden, but as a hard-won wisdom about what it truly means to study the wild. Alex Summers wiped the sweat from his brow as he adjusted his backpack straps, the weight of their contents a familiar comfort against his shoulders. The late July sun beat down on Denali National Park, turning the usually crisp Alaskan air into something thicker, more substantial. He glanced back at the group of 8 tourists trailing behind him on the savage alpine trail, their eager faces flushed with exertion and excitement. This was his 3rd summer guiding for Denali Adventure Tours, and at 26 he had already accumulated enough wilderness experience to handle most situations that arose on these day hikes. Growing up in rural Montana had given him an early appreciation for the outdoors, and after completing his degree in environmental science at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, guiding had seemed the natural choice while he figured out his next steps. "How much farther to the viewpoint, Alex?" called out Diane Reynolds, a retired schoolteacher from Ohio, who despite being in her 60s maintained a pace that put some of the younger hikers to shame. "About another 1.5 miles, Alex replied, pointing toward a ridge in the distance. "Once we get up there, you'll have a clear view of Denali on a good day, which today definitely is." He gestured to the cloudless blue sky stretching overhead. "If we're lucky, we might spot some Dall sheep on the slopes too." The group had assembled at the trailhead at Aitkenkiao that morning, a married couple from Texas, Paul and Jennifer Wilson, a family of 3 from California, the Garcias, Diane, and 2 friends in their 30s, Mike Bennett and Steve Cooper, who had driven up from Anchorage for a weekend getaway. A fairly typical mix for the moderate difficulty hikes that Alex led 3 times a week during the summer season. "Remember to stay hydrated," Alex called out as they continued along the trail. "We'll take another short break in about 20 minutes. He scanned the landscape as they walked, an instinctive habit developed over years spent in bear country. Denali National Park was home to both black bears and grizzlies, and while encounters were relatively rare, they were always a possibility. Alex had seen dozens of bears during his time as a guide, but always at a safe distance. The mandatory safety talk he gave at the beginning of each hike covered proper behavior in bear country. Stay together, make noise, carry bear spray, and know how to use it. The canister of spray hung at his hip, as familiar as his water bottle or GPS. "Alex, is that a moose track?" asked Miguel Garcia, the 13-year-old son of the California family, pointing to an impression in the soft earth of the trail. Alex knelt down to examine the track. "Good eye, Miguel. That's definitely a moose. A big bull from the size of it." He pointed out the distinctive heart-shaped imprint to the rest of the group, who gathered around with interest. "They're usually more active in the early morning and evening, but we might get lucky." The trail continued to climb gradually through a transition zone, the dense spruce forest giving way to dwarf birch and low-growing alpine vegetation. As they gained elevation, the vistas opened up, revealing the dramatic landscape that made Denali one of the crown jewels of the national park system. The group's pace slowed as they stopped frequently to take photos of the sweeping valleys and distant peaks. "Folks, remember what I said about keeping noise levels up in bear country," Alex reminded them, after noticing they had fallen into a hushed reverence at the scenery. "Normal conversation is fine, singing is even better. Bears don't like surprises any more than we do." Paul the Texan chuckled. "You don't want to hear me sing, son. I'd scare away every living creature in a 5-mile radius." "So that's the idea," Alex replied with a grin. "The last thing we want is to startle a bear at close range." The group continued their ascent, chatting more deliberately now. Alex kept them moving at a steady pace, knowing that the viewpoint would make a perfect lunch spot before they began their return journey. The park regulations discouraged lingering too long in any one location to minimize impact, and Alex prided himself on adhering to the leave no trace principles. As they neared the highest point of the trail, a vast panorama spread out before them. The massive form of Denali dominated the horizon, its snow-capped peak gleaming in the midday sun. Even after countless viewings, the sight still filled Alex with a sense of awe. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to one of the best views in Alaska," he announced, gesturing toward the mountain. Denali, formerly known as Mount McKinley, stands at 2,310 feet, making it the highest peak in North America. The group spread out slightly along the ridgeline, cameras clicking furiously as they attempted to capture the majesty of the scene. Alex allowed them their moment of wonder before gathering them together for a safety reminder. "We'll stop here for lunch, but remember to stay within sight of each other. Keep your food secure, and we'll pack out everything we bring in." He surveyed the group as they settled onto rocks and pulled out sandwiches and trail mix from their day packs. And as always, stay alert. This open area gives us good visibility, which is perfect for spotting wildlife and for them to spot us. The lunch break passed pleasantly, with the tourists sharing stories of their travels and asking Alex questions about park wildlife and geography. He fielded their queries easily, drawing on his knowledge of the area and his environmental science background. "Have you ever had a dangerous encounter with a bear?" Steve asked as he repacked his lunch container. Alex shook his head. "I've seen plenty of bears, but always at a distance. The key is mutual respect. We stay out of their way, and they generally stay out of ours. Black bears are more common on this side of the park, but grizzlies are around too. Sows with cubs are the ones to be most cautious about." "What's the difference between a black bear and a grizzly?" Jennifer asked, adjusting her sun hat against the glare. "Size, for one thing. Grizzlies are significantly larger," Alex explained. "They also have a distinctive shoulder hump that black bears lack, and their face profile is different, more dish-shaped. Their claws are longer too, adapted for digging up roots and small mammals." He paused. "But the main thing to remember is that their behavior can differ. Black bears are more likely to flee if threatened, while grizzlies, especially females protecting cubs, may stand their ground or charge. The best strategy with any bear is avoidance." After lunch, they began their descent, taking a slightly different route that would loop back to their starting point. This section of the trail dipped briefly into a shallow valley before climbing again to another ridge. The terrain changed from open alpine to a mixture of scrubby vegetation and small copses of trees. Berry bushes lined portions of the trail, their branches heavy with ripening fruit. "These blueberries are almost ready," Alex noted, pointing to clusters of berries transitioning from green to a dusty blue. "Another week or two and they'll be perfect. Bears love them too. It's an important food source as they fatten up for winter." "When do bears hibernate around here?" asked Elena Garcia, Miguel's mother. "They typically den up in October or November, depending on the weather and food availability," Alex replied. "And they'll emerge in April or May, during hyperphagia. That's the period in late summer, and fall when they're intensively feeding to gain weight. A bear can consume up to 20,000 calories a day." As they continued their descent, the trail narrowed somewhat, cutting through a section where the vegetation grew thicker on either side. Tall grasses and berry bushes created a corridor effect, limiting visibility beyond the immediate trail. Alex instinctively picked up his pace slightly, not wanting to linger in an area with reduced sightlines. "Let's keep moving through this section," he called back to the group. "Stay close together." They had nearly cleared the thickest part of the vegetation when Alex heard it. A distinctive huffing sound from somewhere to their right, beyond a stand of dwarf birch trees. He froze, instantly recognizing the sound of an agitated bear. "Stop," he said quietly but firmly, raising his hand in a halting gesture. The group bunched up behind him, sensing the sudden tension. Nobody moved for a moment. The huffing came again, followed by a low growl that raised the hair on the back of Alex's neck. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound, and his breath caught in his throat. Through a gap in the vegetation, no more than 30 yards away, stood a massive grizzly sow, her fur a rich brown with silver-tipped guard hairs that gave the species its grizzled appearance. Her head was lowered, ears flattened against her skull, classic signs of aggression. Worse, 2 small cubs scrambled up a nearby tree at their mother's signal of danger. Alex's mind raced through his training. They had inadvertently come between a mother and her cubs, potentially the most dangerous situation in bear encounters. The trail they were on must have separated the family momentarily, and now the mother perceived them as a threat to her young. "We have a grizzly sow with cubs, off the trail to our right," he said in a calm, low voice, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Nobody run or make sudden movements. We're going to slowly back away, staying together as a group." The tourists' reactions ranged from silent terror to barely suppressed panic. Mike whispered a curse, while Jennifer let out a small whimper. Miguel pressed closer to his parents, his eyes wide with fear. "Alex, what do we do?" Paulie whispered hoarsely, his Texan drawl thickened by stress. "Follow my lead," Alex replied steadily, though adrenaline coursed through his system. "We'll move slowly backward the way we came. No sudden movements, no running." He reached carefully for the bear spray on his belt. "I've got spray if we need it, but let's try to de-escalate first." The group began to inch backward, with Alex keeping himself between the bear and the tourists. The grizzly sow watched them intently, her mass deceptively light on her feet as she took a few steps toward them, still huffing and swaying her head from side to side, a clear warning. "Keep going," Alex murmured, slow and steady. They had retreated perhaps 15 feet when Miguel's foot caught on an exposed root. He stumbled, catching himself before falling, but letting out a startled yelp in the process. The sound acted like a trigger. The sow rose to her full height, nearly 8 feet tall on her hind legs, and then dropped to all fours with a roar that seemed to shake the very air around them. She charged. "Get back!" Alex shouted, moving forward and to the side, trying to draw the bear's attention away from the group, while simultaneously pulling the bear spray from its holster. "Move up the trail!" The tourists scrambled backward in terror as Alex positioned himself to intercept the charging grizzly. Time seemed to slow down as the massive animal closed the distance between them with frightening speed. At the last moment, Alex raised the canister of bear spray and depressed the trigger, sending a cloud of capsaicin-based deterrent toward the oncoming bear. The spray caught the grizzly full in the face, and she faltered momentarily, shaking her head in confusion and pain, but her maternal instinct and momentum carried her forward. Before Alex could retreat, she was upon him. The impact felt like being hit by a truck. 700 pounds of muscle and fury knocked him flat on his back, driving the air from his lungs. He rolled instinctively, trying to protect his vital areas by curling into a ball as he'd been taught during bear safety training. The grizzly's claws raked across his backpack and then found purchase in the flesh of his back, tearing through his jacket and shirt as though they were tissue paper. Pain exploded across Alex's back as the bear's claws opened deep furrows in his flesh. He cried out, the sound more shock than conscious choice. Somewhere in the background he could hear the screams of the tourists, but they seemed distant compared to the hot breath and thunderous growls of the bear looming over him. The attack lasted only seconds but felt like an eternity. The bear struck him again, this time her claws catching his left shoulder and arm as he tried to shield his head. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault paused. The sow backed off slightly, huffing and growling, her attention divided between the perceived threat and her cubs, who were still treed nearby. Alex lay motionless, fighting against shock and the instinct to flee. Running would only trigger the chase response. Through a haze of pain, he remembered his training. Play dead with a grizzly, fight back with a black bear. He kept his face pressed to the ground, protecting his neck and vital organs, trying to control his ragged breathing. The bear circled him once, sniffing and huffing, then delivered a final powerful swat to his legs before turning away. She moved toward her cubs, grunting softly to them as they scrambled down from the safety of the tree. With a last warning glance back at the humans, the bear family disappeared into the vegetation, moving away from the trail. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then came a flurry of panicked voices. "Alex, oh my God, Alex, is he alive? Someone call for help. We don't have cell service out here." Paul and Mike were the first to reach him, approaching cautiously as though the bear might reappear. "At any moment." "Don't move him," Diane said sharply, her teacher's authority cutting through the chaos. "He could have spinal injuries." Alex managed to turn his head slightly. "The bear," he gasped. "Is it gone?" "It's gone," Mike confirmed, kneeling beside him. "Jesus Christ, man, you're bleeding badly." The pain hit him in waves now, hot and insistent. He could feel blood soaking through his shredded clothing and pooling beneath him on the trail. "My pack," he managed. "First aid kit and the satellite phone." Jennifer was already rifling through his backpack, which had been partially torn from his body during the attack. "I found the first aid kit," she announced, her hands shaking as she opened it. "The phone is in the side pocket," Alex said, each word an effort. "Emergency contact information is in a laminated card with it." Steve found the satellite phone and the emergency information. "I've got it. What do I tell them?" "Bear attack. Guide injured. Savage Alpine Trails, approximately 2 miles from the trailhead," Alex whispered, fighting to stay conscious as shock began to set in. "Need evacuation." While Steve made the emergency call, the others worked to assess and treat Alex's wounds, as best they could with the limited supplies available. Paul used scissors from the first aid kit to carefully cut away the tattered remains of Alex's jacket and shirt, revealing the full extent of the damage. "Oh, God," Elena gasped, turning away at the sight. Alex couldn't see his back, but the stricken expressions on the others' faces told him enough. The deep claw marks ran diagonally across his back from his right shoulder to his left hip, with additional lacerations on his left arm and shoulder. His hiking pants were torn at the thigh where the bear had struck him last, though that wound seemed less severe. "Apply pressure to control the bleeding," Diane instructed, taking charge of the first aid efforts. As a former teacher, She had basic emergency response training. Use the gauze pads and bandages from the kit. The pain was becoming overwhelming, a burning sensation that threatened to consume his consciousness. Alex focused on his breathing, trying to stay calm and alert. Panic would only accelerate blood loss and shock. Help is on the way, Steve reported, returning from his call. They're dispatching a helicopter from the park headquarters and a ground team with a ranger. They said it might take up to an hour for anyone to reach us. An hour seemed like an eternity in Alex's current state. He knew that in wilderness medicine, the golden hour following traumatic injury was critical for survival. Blood loss and shock were his most immediate concerns. "We need to keep him warm," Diane said, recognizing the signs of shock. Alex's skin had gone clammy and he was beginning to shiver despite the summer heat. "Does anyone have extra layers we can use?" The group quickly shed jackets and outer shirts, draping them gently over Alex's lower body and uninjured areas. Paul emptied his water bottle onto a clean bandana and used it to wipe the sweat and dirt from Alex's face. "Stay with us, buddy," he said, his voice gruff with concern. "That was the bravest damn thing I've ever seen anyone do." Alex tried to respond, but speech seemed increasingly difficult. The world had taken on a strange, distant quality, as though he were viewing it through the wrong end of a telescope. He knew this dissociation was another symptom of shock. "Talk to me, Alex," Diane urged, noticing his fading awareness. "Tell us about your favorite trail in the park. We need you to stay awake." With tremendous effort, Alex focused on her voice, using it as an anchor to consciousness. "Horseshoe Lake," he managed. "Early morning, beavers building, mountains reflected in the water." "That sounds beautiful," she encouraged. "I'd like to see that. You'll have to show us when you're better." Time became fluid, stretching, and compressing in unpredictable ways. Alex drifted in and out of full awareness, the pain holding him in a strange limbo between consciousness and oblivion. The tourists took turns talking to him, keeping him engaged, while others maintained pressure on his wounds and monitored for any sign of the bear's return. It could have been minutes or hours later when they heard the distant thumping of helicopter soroters. Relief swept through the group as the sound grew louder. "They're coming, Alex," Miguel said excitedly, squeezing his uninjured hand. "The helicopter is almost here." The rescue team's arrival brought a flurry of efficient activity. 2 park rangers and a paramedic quickly assessed the situation, establishing that the bear had left the area before turning their attention to Alex. They worked with practiced precision, cutting away the remaining clothing, cleaning the wounds, as best they could in the field, and applying proper pressure dressings. "You've lost a significant amount of blood, but the wounds look clean. No major arterial damage that I can see," the paramedic informed him as she inserted an IV line. "We're going to get you stabilized and airlifted to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital. They have a trauma center that can handle these injuries." One of the rangers, a stocky man with a graying beard who introduced himself as Ranger Michaels, questioned the group about the encounter, while his colleague and the paramedic prepared Alex for transport. "It was a grizzly sow with 2 cubs," Paul explained. "We accidentally got between them on the trail. Alex tried to get us away safely, but when Miguel stumbled, the bear charged. Alex stepped forward and used his spray, but the bear still got to him. He deliberately drew it away from us." "He saved our lives," Jennifer added, her voice breaking. "The bear would have gone through all of us if he hadn't intercepted it." Ranger Michaels nodded grimly. "That matches what we know about maternal grizzly behavior. You folks were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it sounds like your guy did everything by the book." He turned to Alex. "You made the right call, son. Using the spray, protecting your group, playing dead once contact was made. Textbook response in a worst-case scenario." Alex managed a weak nod of acknowledgement as the team secured him to a backboard for transport. The paramedic had administered pain medication through the IV, and the edge of his agony had dulled somewhat, though each movement still sent fresh waves of pain through his ravaged back. "What will happen to the bear?" Miguel asked, his young face troubled. "We'll track her and the cubs to make sure they've moved away from the trail," Ranger Michaels replied. "This incident occurred because she was defending her young, which is natural behavior for a grizzly. Unless she shows predatory behavior or returns to the scene, there's no reason to take further action. We'll likely close this section of trail for a few days as a precaution." The decision was a relief to Alex, despite his injuries. He had devoted his career to helping people appreciate wildlife in its natural habitat, bears included. The sow had been acting on instinct, protecting her cubs from a perceived threat. He didn't want her destroyed for behaving like a wild animal should. Evacuation by helicopter meant being hoisted up in a basket stretcher, a process that, despite the paramedics' best efforts, sent jagged bolts of pain through Alex's injuries. Once aboard, the medical team continued their treatment during the short flight to Fairbanks, monitoring his vital signs and administering fluids to counteract blood loss and shock. "You're doing great," the flight paramedic assured him over the roar of the helicopter. "We'll have you in the ER in about 20 minutes. Alex drifted in and out of consciousness during the flight, the vibration of the helicopter and the medication creating a surreal, dreamlike state. Images flashed through his mind: the bear rising on her hind legs, the tourists' terrified faces, the spray canister in his hand, the blur of brown fur and flashing claws. It felt simultaneously like something that had happened years ago and something that was still occurring. The helicopter landed on the hospital roof, and Alex was quickly transferred to a waiting trauma team. The bright lights of the emergency department stung his eyes as he was wheeled inside, surrounded by a flurry of activity and urgent voices. Bear attack victim, male, mid-20s, multiple deep lacerations to the back, left shoulder, and left thigh, the flight paramedic reported to the receiving doctor. Approximately 2 to 3 hours since injury. He's lost significant blood volume but has been responsive. We've given him IV fluids and 5 of morphine for pain. Let's get him into Trauma 1, the doctor ordered. I want a full set of labs, type and cross for 4 units, tetanus booster, and broad-spectrum antibiotics. Notify the surgical team. We'll need them for wound debridement and repair. The next few hours passed in a blur of examinations, treatments, and questions. Alex's wounds were thoroughly cleaned, a process that required additional sedation. X-rays and CT scans were taken to check for bone damage or foreign bodies in the wounds. Fortunately, the bear's claws had torn through flesh and muscle, but had missed his spine and hadn't penetrated deeply enough to damage internal organs. "You're very lucky, all things considered," the trauma surgeon told him once the initial assessment was complete. "The lacerations are deep but clean. We'll need to surgically debride and repair them, but I don't anticipate any lasting functional impairment. However, you will have substantial scarring." Scarring seemed like a small price to pay for survival. Alex nodded weakly, the combined effects of pain medication, exhaustion, and trauma making it difficult to fully process the information. "What about infection risk?" he managed to ask, aware that bacterial contamination was a significant concern. "With animal-inflicted wounds, we've started you on powerful antibiotics as a precaution," the doctor assured him. "Bear claws can introduce various bacteria into the wounds, but we've thoroughly cleaned them and will continue to monitor closely for any signs of infection. You'll also need rabies prophylaxis, standard procedure for wild animal attacks, though rabies is rare in Alaskan bears." The surgical team arrived to prepare him for the operation. As the anesthesiologist explained the procedure, Alex found himself wondering about his tour group. Had someone informed the company what happened? Were the tourists all right after witnessing such a traumatic event? He tried to ask, but the sedative was already taking effect, drawing him down into a deep and dreamless sleep. When Alex awoke in the recovery room, the first sensation was pain, duller than before but still insistent, a burning throb that radiated from his back and shoulder. A nurse noticed his stirring and approached the bedside. "Welcome back, Mr. Summers," she said, checking his vital signs. "The surgery went well. Dr. Reeves will be in to speak with you once you're a bit more awake." Alex's throat felt raw from the breathing tube used during surgery. "Water?" he rasped. The nurse helped him take small sips through a straw, careful not to disturb his position. He was lying on his right side, unable to rest on his back due to the extensive wounds. "My tour group," he managed after moistening his throat. "Are they okay?" "They're all fine," the nurse assured him. "They were brought back to the park headquarters by the ground team. Your employer has been notified, and I believe some of the group may still be in the waiting area. They've been very concerned about you." Relief washed over him. At least no one else had been hurt. He'd done his job, protecting his clients despite the catastrophic outcome for himself. Dr. Reeves, the trauma surgeon, arrived shortly afterward to explain the procedure and prognosis. "We debrided and repaired the lacerations on your back, shoulder and thigh," she explained. "The damage was primarily to the skin and underlying muscle tissue, with no significant injury to bones, nerves, or internal organs. You required numerous stitches both internally and externally, and we inserted surgical drains to prevent fluid buildup." She showed him post-operative photos of his injuries on a tablet. The images were jarring. 4 deep parallel gashes ran diagonally across his back, meticulously stitched but still angry and raw-looking. Similar but less severe wounds marked his left shoulder and arm, and a single laceration ran across his left thigh. These will heal, but as I mentioned before, you will have significant scarring, Dr. Reeves continued. Physical therapy will be important for restoring full range of motion, especially in your left shoulder. We expect a recovery period of at least 6 to 8 weeks before you can resume normal activities, and possibly longer before you're ready for physically demanding work. The timeline hit Alex hard. The summer guiding season would be long over by then. His income for the year, already limited to the few months of peak tourism, would be severely impacted. More importantly, his identity as an outdoorsman and guide felt suddenly precarious. Would he ever feel safe on the trails again? When can I be discharged? He asked, already concerned about mounting medical bills. Not for at least 3 to 4 days, the surgeon replied firmly. We need to monitor for infection, manage your pain, and ensure the wounds are healing properly before sending you home. And even then, you'll need someone to assist you for the first couple of weeks. The location of your injuries makes self-care challenging. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. Alex closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the implications of his injuries and the long recovery ahead. I understand it's a lot to process, Dr. Reeves said gently. We have counselors available if you'd like to speak with someone about the psychological aspects of surviving such a traumatic event. Many attack survivors experience PTSD symptoms. Alex nodded, though seeking psychological help wasn't something that came naturally to him. Growing up in rural Montana, he'd been raised with a stoic approach to hardship, but he recognized that this experience went beyond anything he'd ever faced before. I'd like to see my group, if they're still here, he said finally. I'll check on that for you, the surgeon promised, but keep it brief, you need rest. To Alex's surprise, not only were Paul and Jennifer from Texas still in the waiting area, but Diane had also stayed behind, while the others were escorted back to their accommodations. They were allowed to visit briefly, one at a time. Paul came in first, his weathered face etched with concern. Hey there, Trailblazer, he said, using the nickname he'd given Alex at the beginning of the hike. You're looking better than the last time I saw you, which isn't saying much. Alex attempted a smile, which turned into a grimace as he shifted position. Sorry about cutting the tour short, he joked weakly. Paul shook his head, his expression serious. Don't you dare apologize. You saved our lives out there, son. What you did. He paused, emotion making his voice rough. Stepping between us and that bear, I've never seen anything braver in my life. Just doing my job, Alex murmured, uncomfortable with the praise. Like hell it was, Paul countered. Your job is to show tourists pretty views and tell us about plants, not wrestle grizzly bears. He leaned closer. Jennifer and I want to help with your medical expenses. We know this kind of thing can be financially devastating, especially for a seasonal worker. The offer touched Alex deeply, though pride made him hesitate. That's incredibly generous, but no buts, Paul interrupted. We've been blessed financially, and we want to do this. I've already spoken to your employer about setting up some kind of assistance fund. The rest of the group wants to contribute too. Before Alex could respond, a nurse entered to indicate that the visit needed to conclude. Paul squeezed his hand carefully. Rest up, we'll be in touch. Jennifer came in next. Her eyes reddened from crying. Oh, Alex, she said, her voice breaking. I don't even know what to say except thank you. Paul told me about the fund we're setting up. Please let us help. It's the least we can do. Alex found himself too moved to argue. The kindness of these virtual strangers was overwhelming, especially in his vulnerable state. Diane was the last to visit, her teacher's pragmatism a balm after the emotional intensity of the previous visits. You're going to need practical help during your recovery, she stated matter-of-factly. Do you have family nearby who can assist? Alex shook his head. My parents are still in Montana and I don't have siblings. Most of my friends here are other seasonal workers. They'll be busy with their own guiding schedules. Diane nodded, thoughtfully. I'm staying in Alaska for another month. I'd been planning to volunteer with a literacy program in Fairbanks after this tour. I could help with transportation to medical appointments, grocery shopping, that sort of thing, at least for a few weeks. The offer stunned Alex. That's incredibly kind, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition if it's freely offered, Diane interrupted with the firm tone that had probably quelled thousands of unruly students over her career. And frankly, I think it would help me process what happened as well. We all experienced a trauma out there, even if we weren't physically injured. By the time the visitors left, Alex was exhausted but touched by their generosity and concern. The nurse administered his evening pain medication, and he drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with running bears and the sensation of falling. The next few days in the hospital established a rhythm of pain management, wound care, and initial physical therapy assessments. Various officials also visited, park rangers completing their incident report, a wildlife biologist studying bear-human interactions, and representatives from Denali Adventure Tours, his employer. Lisa Chen, the company's operations manager, brought flowers and the news that his job would be held for him whenever he was ready to return, whether this season or the next. The company insurance should cover most of your medical expenses, she explained, and we've been overwhelmed with donations from your tour group and others who've heard the story. People are calling you a hero. Alex shifted uncomfortably, both from his injuries and the characterization. I'm not a hero, Lisa. I made a mistake. I should have been more alert for signs of bear activity in that section of trail, especially with the berries ripening. Stop that, Lisa said firmly. Ranger Michaels said you did everything by the book. Sometimes nature just happens, even to the most prepared people. The important thing is that no one died, and that's because of your quick thinking. She paused. Though I understand if you don't want to return to guiding after this. The comment struck a nerve Alex hadn't fully acknowledged. Did he want to go back to the trails? The thought of encountering another bear sent a cold shiver through him, but the idea of giving up the work he loved was equally disturbing. I need time to think about it, he admitted. Ranger Michaels visited on the third day, bringing the completed incident report for Alex to review. The document was thorough, detailing the circumstances of the encounter, the actions taken by both Alex and the bear, and the subsequent rescue operation. We've been tracking the sow and her cubs, Michaels informed him. They've moved deeper into the park, away from the trail system. It's a good sign. Suggests she's not habituated to humans and was just reacting to a perceived threat to her cubs. That's good to hear, Alex said sincerely. I never wanted her destroyed because of this. The ranger nodded approvingly. That's the right attitude. Too many people personalize these encounters, as if the bear was being malicious. She was just being a bear. He closed the report folder. The section of trail has been reopened with additional warning signs. We're also using this incident for our bear safety education programs, if that's all right with you. Of course, Alex agreed. Anything that might help prevent someone else from going through this. Speaking of which, Michaels continued, once you're recovered, we'd be interested in having you speak to our seasonal staff about your experience. First-hand accounts are invaluable for training. The offer planted a seed in Alex's mind, a way to use his traumatic experience constructively to help others stay safe in bear country. It wasn't guiding, but it was still connected to the work and places he loved. I'd like that, he said thoughtfully. On the fourth day, Dr. Reeves deemed him stable enough for discharge, provided he had adequate support for his recovery. Diane had arranged to drive him to his small apartment in Healy, the town just outside Denali National Park, where many seasonal workers lived. The transition from hospital to home brought fresh challenges. Simple tasks like dressing, showering, or preparing food became complex obstacles, requiring careful planning to avoid pulling at his stitches or putting pressure on his wounds. Diane proved invaluable, helping him establish systems for managing daily activities with minimal strain. You're adapting well, she observed, as she changed his dressings one afternoon, a week after the attack. Your wounds look good, no signs of infection. Alex caught a glimpse of his back in the bathroom mirror during the dressing change. The wounds were less angry now, but the reality of the scarring he would carry for life was inescapable. 4 parallel lines tracing the bear's final statement on his body. They looked like claw marks on a tree, he commented, trying for lightness. But hearing the strain in his voice, Diane regarded him thoughtfully. Bears mark trees to communicate with other bears, to establish territory and identity. Maybe these marks are part of your story now, a chapter rather than an ending. Her philosophical approach helped Alex begin to integrate the attack into his understanding of himself. He wasn't just a victim, he was a survivor with a unique perspective to share. The physical recovery progressed steadily. Twice-weekly visits to the outpatient clinic in Fairbanks showed consistent improvement. The surgical drains were removed, stitches began to come out, and physical therapy exercises gradually restored mobility to his shoulder. The psychological recovery proved more complex. Nightmares disrupted his sleep several times a week. Vivid recreations of the attack that left him drenched in sweat and trembling. Ordinary sounds, a branch scratching against his window, a dog growling in the distance triggered moments of heart-pounding panic. At his doctor's urging, Alex began seeing a therapist specializing in trauma recovery. The sessions helped him process the attack and develop coping strategies for the anxiety and flashbacks. Gradually, he began to reclaim his sense of security and identity. 3 weeks after the attack, Diane needed to return to Ohio for a family matter. By then, Alex was able to manage most self-care, and another former client from earlier in the summer, a retired nurse named Robert, volunteered to drive him to medical appointments. The Bear Attack Support Network just keeps growing, Alex joked to his therapist during their next session. That's significant, she pointed out. This traumatic event has revealed the compassion of strangers and created meaningful connections. That's a positive to hold on to. As his physical condition improved, Alex began taking short walks around his neighborhood, gradually rebuilding his stamina. The first time he ventured near the edge of the forest that bordered the town, he felt his heart rate spike and his palms grow sweaty. But with each subsequent walk, the reaction diminished. 6 weeks after the attack, he felt ready for a more significant step. He called Ranger Michaels and arranged to visit park headquarters to discuss the educational presentations they had mentioned during his hospital stay. Returning to the park was harder than he had anticipated. As the ranger drove him past the trailhead where the fateful hike had begun, Alex felt his chest tighten and his breathing quicken, the beginning of a panic attack. He closed his eyes using the grounding techniques his therapist had taught him. "You okay?" Michaels asked, noticing his distress. "Getting there," Alex managed, focusing on his breathing until the sensation subsided. "It's my first time back since it happened." Michaels nodded understanding. "Take your time. Many rangers who've had close calls go through something similar. It's a normal response." At headquarters, Alex was surprised by the warm reception from the park staff, many of whom he knew from his years of guiding, but who had not seen him since the attack. Their genuine concern and respect were evident. The education coordinator, Sarah Nilsson, outlined their proposal for incorporating Alex's experience into their bear safety programs. "We'd like you to speak at ranger training sessions and possibly some public presentations about your encounter. What happened, what worked, what you might do differently," she explained. "Your perspective as someone who actually used bear spray in a defensive situation is invaluable. Most people never have to deploy it." "I'd like that," Alex said with growing certainty. "But I'd want to emphasize that bear attacks are extraordinarily rare. I don't want to contribute to unnecessary fear of wildlife." Sarah smiled. "Exactly the balanced approach we're looking for. We're also developing materials for tour companies to improve their guide training. Your input would be valuable there as well." The conversation shifted to the logistics of creating educational content, filming a short interview, developing presentation materials, establishing a schedule for speaking engagements that accommodated his ongoing recovery. "We can offer a stipend for your time," Sarah added. "It wouldn't replace guiding income, but it might help while you're healing." The practical support was welcome, but Alex found he was more motivated by the opportunity to give his traumatic experience purpose. If his story could help even one person avoid a similar situation or respond more effectively in a crisis, the suffering would have meaning. As they finished their meeting, Michaels mentioned that they had received the final results from the FEE DNA testing done on samples collected from Alex's clothing after the attack. "We confirmed it was a sow grizzly approximately 8 years old, based on genetic markers we've catalogued during previous research studies," he explained. "She and her cubs have been photographed by wildlife monitoring cameras several times since the incident, all in areas well away from tourist trails. They appear to be thriving." The news brought Alex an unexpected sense of closure. The bear was doing what bears should do, living wild, raising her cubs, avoiding human contact when possible. The encounter that had so dramatically altered his life had been just a momentary intersection of their separate worlds. By the 8-week mark, Alex had regained enough strength and mobility to consider his longer-term plans. The guiding season was winding down with the approach of autumn, and most seasonal workers were preparing to leave for winter jobs elsewhere or return to school. Lisa from Denali Adventure Tours invited him to the company's end-of-season staff gathering. It would be his first time seeing many of his colleagues since the attack, and he approached the event with mixed emotions: anticipation at reconnecting, anxiety about their reactions, uncertainty about his future with the company. The gathering was held at a local restaurant that catered to park staff and residents of the small community. When Alex entered, leaning slightly on a cane he still used for longer walks, the room fell momentarily silent before erupting in applause. The unexpected reception brought a lump to his throat. His fellow guides surrounded him, offering careful hugs, asking about his recovery, sharing stories from the remainder of the season. Many had sent cards or messages during his hospitalization, but seeing them in person, Witnessing their genuine relief at his survival and progress reinforced the strength of the community he'd found in Alaska. Over dinner, Lisa approached him with a proposal. "We've been working with the Park Service on enhancing our bear safety protocols and guide training," she explained. "After what happened, we want to make sure all our staff are as prepared as possible. We'd like you to help develop and lead this training program for next season's guides." The offer crystallized the direction Alex had been considering since his conversation with the park rangers. "A bear safety instructor instead of a trail guide," he clarified. "For as long as you need," Lisa confirmed. "It could be temporary while you continue healing, or a permanent position if that's what you prefer. You'd still be in the field occasionally for demonstrations, but it would be more controlled situations without the responsibility for tourists." Alex considered the proposal carefully. It would allow him to remain connected to the work and place he loved while accommodating both his physical limitations and the psychological aftermath of the attack. It also acknowledged his unique perspective as someone who had experienced and survived what he had previously only trained for theoretically. "I'd like that," he decided. "It feels right, using what happened to make things safer for everyone, guides and tourists alike." They discussed the details over dessert, the curriculum development over the winter months, the training schedule for the spring, the compensation package. By the time they finished, Alex felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had a path forward, one that honored both his pre-attack identity and the person he was becoming through his recovery. As autumn painted the park in golds and reds, Alex continued his physical rehabilitation. The deep tissue damage required ongoing therapy, but he progressed from using a cane to walking unassisted, then to gentle hiking on level terrain. His therapist cleared him for increasingly challenging activities with the caveat that he listened to his body and respect its new limitations. The psychological healing paralleled the physical. The nightmares became less frequent, the flashbacks less intrusive. He still startled at unexpected sounds in the forest, but the response no longer paralyzed him. With his therapist's encouragement, he began journaling about the attack and his recovery, finding that articulating the experience helped integrate it into his life narrative. In late September, an unexpected email arrived from Miguel Garcia, the teenager from the California family who had been on the tour. Attached was a school essay titled "The Bravest Person I Know," describing the bear attack and Alex's actions from Miguel's perspective. The boy had received an A and wanted to share it with the subject of his essay. The gesture moved Alex deeply. He responded with thanks and an update on his recovery, emphasizing that the experience hadn't diminished his love for the park or its wildlife, a message he hoped might help Miguel process any lingering trauma from witnessing the attack. As winter approached, most seasonal workers departed Healy for jobs in ski resorts or warmer climates. Alex, now committed to developing the bear safety program, decided to remain in Alaska. He found a cabin rental in Fairbanks that would allow him to continue his medical follow-ups while working remotely on the training materials. The first significant snowfall transformed the landscape, covering the last visible signs of summer. Alex stood at his cabin window, watching the flakes drift down in the twilight. The bear and her cubs would be denning soon, sleeping away the winter months while he planned and prepared for the next season. He touched the scars on his back through his shirt, feeling the ridged texture that had become part of his identity. They no longer caused pain, just occasional stiffness after strenuous activity or in cold weather. His body had healed remarkably well, the human capacity for recovery proving itself once again. The mental scars were less visible, but equally permanent. He would never again walk a wilderness trail with the casual confidence of his pre-attack self. But that loss had been balanced by gains, a deeper appreciation for life, stronger connections with others, a clearer sense of purpose. As winter deepened, Alex divided his time between physical therapy, consulting with the Park Service on bear management policies, and developing the training program for Denali Adventure Tours. He created scenarios based on his experience, emphasizing the signs he had missed and the decisions that had worked. In January, he received an invitation to speak at a wilderness safety conference in Anchorage. His presentation, Anatomy of a Bear Attack, a Guide's Perspective, drew on both his personal experience and the research he had immersed himself in during recovery. The audience of park rangers, guides, and outdoor educators responded with thoughtful questions and expressions of respect for his willingness to share such a traumatic story. Afterward, a wildlife biologist specializing in bear behavior approached him. Your account is valuable because it confirms what we know about maternal defensive attacks, she explained. The sow's behavior, the warning signs, the charge, even breaking off the attack when the perceived threat was neutralized, follows the pattern we've documented. But first-hand accounts from survivors who can articulate what happened are rare. I'm still processing it all, Alex admitted. Sometimes I dream about it, but the dreams are changing. Last week I dreamt I was watching the sow and cubs from a distance through binoculars. No attack, just appreciation for seeing them in their world. The biologist nodded. That integration is important. You're finding a way to honor both the trauma and your connection to wild places. As winter gave way to spring, Alex returned to Healy to prepare for the incoming seasonal staff. His physical recovery had plateaued. He had regained most function, but would always have some limitation in his left shoulder range of motion, and his stamina wasn't quite what it had been before. The medical team deemed these acceptable outcomes, given the severity of his initial injuries. The emotional recovery continued to progress. He had graduated from weekly therapy sessions to monthly check-ins, and he'd begun mentoring another bear attack survivor from the Glacier Bay area who was earlier in the healing process. Sharing his experience and coping strategies gave additional meaning to what he had endured. The first training session with the new seasonal guides was held in early May as the park prepared to open for the summer tourism season. Standing before the group of eager young outdoors enthusiasts, much as he had been when he first came to Denali, Alex felt a momentary surge of anxiety. Would they respect his perspective? Would his experience help them stay safe? He began by introducing himself and briefly recounting the attack, noting the mixture of fascination and apprehension on the guides' faces. Then he held up the canister of bear spray he now carried habitually, even in settings where it wasn't strictly necessary. This probably saved my life, and definitely saved the lives of my tour group, he stated. But it's not a magical talisman. It's a tool that works in conjunction with knowledge, awareness, and proper procedures. Today we're going to talk about the complete system of bear safety, from prevention through response. Over the next several hours, he took them through the training program he had developed. Recognition of bear sign, proper food storage, group management in bear country, appropriate noise levels on the trail, spray deployment techniques, and protocols for reporting bear encounters. The most important thing to remember is that we are visitors in their habitat, he emphasized. Bears aren't looking for trouble with humans. They're looking for food, protecting their young, establishing territory, just being bears. Our job is to give them space to do that while safely guiding our clients through their world. The training concluded with a field exercise, practicing spray deployment with inert canisters and role-playing various encounter scenarios. As they returned to headquarters, one of the new guides approached him. "Can I ask you something personal?" she inquired hesitantly. "Go ahead," Alex encouraged. "Are you ever scared being back out here after what happened?" It was a question he had anticipated and reflected on deeply. "Yes," he answered honestly. "I've learned to coexist with that fear rather than fight it. It keeps me alert and respectful. But it doesn't stop me from being here doing this work." He gestured toward the mountains rising beyond the visitor center. "The moment of the attack was the most terrifying experience of my life, but it doesn't negate the thousands of wonderful moments I've had in these mountains, or the ones still to come." The guide nodded thoughtfully. "Thanks for being straight about that. It helps." As May progressed into June, Alex accompanied different guide teams on their early season hikes, observing their implementations of safety protocols and offering feedback. He didn't lead tours himself, but participated as a safety advisor, gradually reclaiming his comfort in the landscapes he loved. During one such outing on the Savage Alpine Trail, the same trail where the attack had occurred nearly a year earlier, he felt a sense of completion as they passed the approximate location of the encounter. The vegetation had changed with the natural cycle of seasons, showing no trace of the momentous event that had occurred there. Nature had continued, indifferent to the human drama that had briefly intersected with its rhythms. That evening, Alex sat on the porch of his small Healy cabin, watching the extended twilight of the Alaskan summer. A movement at the forest edge caught his attention. A red fox trotting purposefully along the tree line, pausing occasionally to listen for rodents beneath the underbrush. The simple joy of wildlife observation, a pleasure he had feared might be permanently tainted by trauma, washed over him. His satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Paul Wilson, the Texan who had been on the fateful tour. "Jennifer and I are coming back to Denali next month. Would love to see you if you're around. Maybe a short hike if you're up for it." Alex smiled as he typed his response. "I'll be here, and yes to the hike, I know some good trails." He set the phone down and returned his gaze to the landscape before him. The mountains stood as they always had, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow reassuring in their permanence. Somewhere within their valleys and forests, the grizzly sow and her cubs, now yearlings, were going about their lives, perhaps foraging on the early summer berries or fishing in one of the park's many streams. Their paths had crossed once, with life-changing consequences. But in the years since, both had continued their separate journeys, the bear raising her cubs in the wilderness that was her home, Alex rebuilding his life and finding new purpose in the wake of trauma. The scars on his back would forever map the moment their worlds had collided. But they also marked his survival, his adaptation, and ultimately, his choice to remain connected to the wild places that had always defined him, even when they had shown their most dangerous aspect. As the fox disappeared back into the forest, and the light slowly faded from the sky, Alex felt a quiet contentment settle over him. He was changed but not diminished, marked but not defined solely by those marks. And tomorrow, he would walk the trails again, more mindful of their dangers, but equally attuned to their beauty and the privilege of moving through a world still wild enough for bears to roam free. The morning air hung crisp and clean as Dr. Eric Johnson checked his equipment one final time before departing from the small outpost cabin. The September chill in Alaska's Kenai Peninsula had intensified overnight, and his breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the early dawn light. His research permit would expire in 3 days, and he still had several key geological formations to sample before concluding this season's fieldwork. As the senior geologist for the United States Geological Survey's Alaska Division, Eric knew the importance of thoroughness, especially in this relatively understudied region of the Chugach National Forest. "Weather's holding for now," said Pete. Donovan, the veteran bush pilot, who had been ferrying Eric to remote sites for the past 5 years, Pete's weathered face creased into a smile as he helped load the last of the equipment into the de Havilland Beaver. "But I've got a feeling about those clouds building to the north, barometric pressures dropping faster than expected." Eric nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon where dark clouds were indeed gathering in the distance. At 43, he had spent enough time in the Alaskan wilderness to respect both the weather and Pete's intuition. "I'll stick to the planned coordinates. The site is in a relatively sheltered valley, should give me some protection if things turn. You're still good for pickup tomorrow at 1600? "Barring acts of God or grumpy bears," Pete chuckled, his standard response that usually lightened the mood. This time, however, Eric felt an odd prickling sensation between his shoulder blades at the mention of bears. September meant the brown bears would be in hyperphagia, aggressively feeding to pack on calories before hibernation. He had encountered them numerous times over his career without incident, always maintaining a respectful distance and following proper protocols. Still, he double-checked the bear spray canister attached to his belt and the signal flare gun secured in its holster. "Got your satellite phone charged?" Pete asked, his tone slightly more serious. Eric patted the padded case nestled in his jacket's inner pocket. "Fully charged, and I've got the solar charger packed if needed." The flight to the research site took 47 minutes, during which Eric reviewed his field notes and GPS coordinates. The area had shown promising indicators of unique metamorphic rock formations, potentially offering new insights into the tectonic history of the region. As Pete circled the small clearing that would serve as Eric's temporary base, both men scanned for any signs of large wildlife. "Looks clear," Pete said, bringing the plane down smoothly onto the small lake adjacent to the clearing. "But keep your eyes open. Saw some fresh bear sign about 5 miles east when I flew the wildlife biologists out last week." Eric nodded, absorbing the information without comment. Wildlife encounters were part of the job, and he had long ago learned to balance caution with practicality. As he unloaded his gear onto the shore, Pete helped him assemble the small reinforced research tent designed to withstand the elements and provide some protection from curious wildlife. "I'll be back tomorrow at 1600, Pete repeated, shaking Eric's hand firmly. "Earlier if that weather system accelerates, keep the sat phone handy." "Always do." "Thanks, Pete." As the plane's engine roared back to life, Eric felt the familiar sensation of isolation settle over him. There was something both unnerving and exhilarating about being alone in such vast wilderness, knowing the nearest human was now rapidly disappearing into the distance. The knowledge that he was the only person within a 20-mile radius carried a weight of responsibility that had become familiar over the years, but never trivial. Eric methodically organized his camp, securing food items in the bear-resistant container positioned a proper distance from his tent. He marked the perimeter with colored surveyor's tape, more as a psychological boundary than any real deterrent. By mid-morning, he was ready to begin his work, shouldering his specialized backpack containing sample collection equipment, water, emergency supplies, and his lunch. The first collection site was approximately 1.2 miles northeast of his camp, where satellite imaging had revealed exposed rock faces, likely containing the formations he sought. The forest was oddly quiet as he hiked, the usual calls of birds muted, perhaps by the approaching weather system. Eric maintained awareness of his surroundings while mentally reviewing the day's objectives. The temperatures had risen slightly, and he unzipped his jacket as he navigated through dense stands of spruce and hemlock. The occasional raspberry thicket caused him to make more noise, clapping his hands and calling out, "Hey bear!" at regular intervals. Berry patches were prime feeding grounds, and surprisingly, bear was the fastest route to a dangerous encounter. By noon, Eric had reached his primary sampling site, a small outcropping of rock exposed by erosion on a hillside. He meticulously documented the location, taking photographs and GPS readings before extracting several rock samples. The formations showed exactly the characteristics he had hoped for, evidence of intense pressure and heat that had transformed the original sedimentary material into something far more complex. Each sample was carefully labeled, recorded, and stored in his pack. Eric paused to eat his lunch, sitting on a fallen log with a clear view of his surroundings. The clouds had continued to gather, and the wind had picked up, bringing with it the distant scent of rain. He checked his watch. 12:47 p.m. He had time to investigate one more site before returning to camp. According to his maps, there was another promising outcropping about half a mile further north. He packed up his lunch remnants, ensuring no food scraps remained, and continued his hike. The terrain grew steeper, requiring more careful footing. As he ascended, at 1:36 p.m. he reached the second site, a more substantial rock face that jutted dramatically from the hillside. Eric felt a rush of excitement as he examined the formations. The preliminary visual assessment confirmed his hypothesis about the region's geological history. He extracted several more samples, meticulously documenting each one. As he worked, the first few raindrops began to fall. Eric glanced at the darkening sky and decided it was time to head back to camp. He had what he needed from this site, and the weather was deteriorating faster than predicted. Securing his pack, he began the descent, choosing a slightly different route that appeared to offer more cover from the intensifying rainfall. The path took him through a denser section of forest, where visibility was reduced by the thick vegetation. Eric maintained his "hey bear" calls, now more frequent in the reduced visibility. The rain had intensified from a sprinkle to a steady downpour, and he pulled the hood of his jacket tighter around his face. The sound of the rain hitting the leaves created a constant background noise that further diminished his ability to detect other sounds. At 2:28 p.m., Eric emerged into a small clearing. He paused to check his GPS and confirm his bearing when movement at the far edge of the clearing caught his attention. His breath caught in his throat as he registered the massive form of a brown bear, its head raised, clearly alerted to his presence. It was a large male, probably close to 800 pounds, with the distinctive shoulder hump characteristic of Ursus arctos, the brown bear species that included the Alaskan grizzly. Eric's training kicked in immediately. He avoided direct eye contact while maintaining awareness of the bear's position. Slowly, he began to back away, speaking in a calm, firm voice. "Hey bear, just passing through. No trouble here." He kept his hands visible and reached very slowly for the bear spray on his belt, not removing it but ensuring it was accessible. The bear lowered its head, swaying slightly from side to side, a sign of agitation or indecision. It was approximately 50 yards away, too close for comfort, but still outside the immediate danger zone. Eric continued his slow retreat, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The rain had temporarily subsided, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the dripping of water from leaves and Eric's steady, measured voice. For several tense moments, it seemed the encounter would end peacefully. The bear turned slightly, appearing to lose interest. Eric felt the knot in his stomach begin to loosen. Then the wind shifted, carrying Eric's scent more directly toward the animal. The bear's reaction was immediate and alarming. It raised its head sharply, nostrils flaring, and then dropped onto all fours, facing Eric fully. "Easy, bear," Eric continued, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Just moving along here. He had backed up nearly to the edge of the clearing, where the denser tree line might offer some protection or a potential escape route. The bear took a few steps forward, then stopped again, seeming uncertain. Eric knew that any sudden movement might trigger a charge, but remaining in the open clearing left him dangerously exposed. Continuing his calm retreat, he reached the tree line and began to move laterally, intending to circle back toward his campsite while maintaining as much distance as possible from the bear. The strategy might have worked if not for two critical factors: the unstable ground, saturated from the recent rainfall, and the bear's heightened state due to hyperphagia. As Eric navigated through the edge of the forest, his foot slipped on a mud-slicked root, causing him to stumble briefly. The sudden movement was all it took. The bear charged. The speed of a charging brown bear is often underestimated. Despite their massive size, they can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour, far faster than any human can run. Eric had no chance of outpacing the animal. Instead, he dropped to the ground, curling into a protective position, hands linked behind his neck to protect his vital areas. He closed his eyes, the sound of crashing undergrowth and heavy breathing growing terrifyingly loud. The impact never came. Eric risked opening his eyes to see the bear had halted its charge about 15 feet away. It stood on its hind legs, swaying slightly, an intimidation display rather than an attack. Eric remained absolutely still, hardly daring to breathe. The bear dropped back to all fours and circled, snorting and huffing, clearly agitated but not yet committed to an attack. In that moment of suspended terror, Eric became acutely aware of his surroundings: the smell of wet earth and vegetation, the sound of water dripping from leaves, the heavy breathing of the bear, and the pounding of his own heart. Time seemed to stretch and distort, seconds expanding into what felt like hours. The bear made another partial charge, stopping just short, another bluff or warning. Eric maintained his protective posture, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. His thoughts raced to his training: play dead for a brown bear attack, fight back against a black bear. This was definitely a brown bear, and his best chance was to convince it he posed no threat. The third charge wasn't a bluff. The bear closed the distance with frightening speed, and Eric felt the massive weight crash into him. Pain exploded across his back and shoulder as the bear's claws tore through his jacket and into flesh. The world reduced to a chaotic blur of pain, noise, and movement. Eric maintained his protective curl as best he could, even as he was battered and rolled by the enormous animal. The attack seemed both endless and instantaneous. Eric was vaguely aware of warm wetness spreading across his back, knowing it was his own blood, but unable to assess the severity of his injuries. The bear's hot breath reeked of wild meat and decay as it snuffled around Eric's head, delivering another powerful blow that sent waves of agony through his already injured shoulder. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. Through a haze of pain, Eric sensed the bear backing away, still huffing but no longer making contact. He remained motionless, afraid any movement might restart the attack. Long minutes passed before he dared to shift slightly, expecting renewed aggression. When none came, he cautiously raised his head just enough to see that the bear had moved about 20 feet away and was now sitting on its haunches, watching him with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. Eric knew that looking directly at the bear might be perceived as a challenge, so he averted his gaze while maintaining peripheral awareness of the animal's position. Slowly, agonizingly, he assessed his condition. His left shoulder and upper back had taken the brunt of the attack. He could feel blood soaking through his clothing, but the fact that he could move his fingers and toes gave him hope that no major nerves or his spine had been damaged. The pain was intense but manageable, shock providing a temporary buffer that he knew wouldn't last. The bear remained in place, occasionally sniffing the air, but making no move to approach again. Eric needed to reach his emergency kit to treat his wounds and contact help, but his pack lay several feet away where it had been torn from his back during the attack. Any movement to retrieve it risked triggering another charge. Time crawled by, marked only by the steady drip of rain from the surrounding vegetation and the increasingly insistent throb of pain from Eric's injuries. The bear eventually stood and ambled a short distance away, periodically glancing back at Eric, but maintaining the separation. Eric wondered if it was the same bear that Pete had mentioned seeing signs of to the east. The thought of Pete brought a fierce longing for his scheduled pickup, still almost 24 hours away. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the bear's interest seemed to wane. It wandered to the edge of the clearing, occasionally turning to look in Eric's direction, but gradually increasing the distance between them. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the bear disappeared into the forest, headed north. Eric waited another 20 minutes before attempting to move, fighting the urge to rush for his pack and satellite phone. When he finally did reach for the pack, every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his injured shoulder. The bear spray had never made it out of its holster. Everything had happened too quickly. Now, he fumbled with bloody fingers to open the pack and locate the first aid kit. The wounds were difficult to see, but Eric could tell from the amount of blood and the shooting pain that they were serious. Using the small mirror from his emergency kit, he caught glimpses of 3 long gashes across his left shoulder blade and upper back. The bear's claws had sliced through his heavy jacket, thermal layer, and deep into the flesh beneath. He cleaned the wounds as best he could with antiseptic wipes, knowing infection was a serious risk. Applying pressure bandages was awkward and painful, but eventually he managed to cover the worst of the lacerations. Next, he retrieved the satellite phone. His hands trembled as he dialed Pete's emergency contact number. The connection took agonizing seconds to establish. "Pete Donovan," came the familiar voice, somewhat distorted by the satellite connection. "Pete, it's Eric. I've been attacked by a bear. I'm injured but stable. Current location is..." He checked his GPS unit, thankful it had survived in the padded side pocket of his pack. "Latitude 60.487, longitude 149.653. There was a moment of silence before Pete's voice returned, now sharp with concern. "How bad are you hurt? Can you make it back to your camp?" Eric considered the question. His camp was approximately 1.7 miles from his current position. Under normal circumstances, an easy walk. Now, with blood loss and pain making him lightheaded, it seemed a daunting distance. "I'm mobile, but it won't be quick. Lacerations to my back and shoulder. Bleeding is mostly controlled." "Understood. Listen carefully, Eric. I can't get to you tonight. Weather's deteriorated significantly up here. A night flying into that area would be suicide with the current conditions. Can you secure yourself somewhere until morning?" The news was a blow, though not unexpected. Eric glanced at the darkening sky. It was only about 4:30 p.m., but daylight was already fading, and the temperature would drop significantly after sunset. "I'll need to try getting back to my tent and supplies. I've got enough in my pack for basic overnight, but the bear might..." "Return." "Agreed. Head toward your camp if you can, but don't push too hard. I'll coordinate with emergency services, but realistically, I'm your best bet for extraction. First light, I'll be in the air. That's about 6:30 a.m. Can you hang on? That long?" "No choice," Eric replied, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "I'll keep the phone on, batteries at 82%. Save it. I'll try contact at 8 p.m. and again at 6 a.m. Otherwise, keep it off to preserve battery." "And Eric..." "Yeah? Don't. You dare die on me. Paperwork's a nightmare." The attempt at humor brought a ghost of a smile to Eric's face. "Wouldn't dream of it." After ending the call, Eric took stock of his situation. It was imperative he reach his camp before dark. There he had shelter, more extensive medical supplies, food, and perhaps most importantly, a more defensible position. The bear-resistant food container was properly positioned away from the tent, and while the tent itself wouldn't stop a determined bear, it offered more protection than the open forest. Standing was an exercise in willpower. The pain that had been somewhat manageable while lying still flared white-hot with movement. Eric gritted his teeth and forced himself upright, using a nearby tree for support until the worst of the dizziness passed. His pack felt impossibly heavy, the normally comfortable weight now an agonizing burden on his injured shoulder. He considered abandoning some of the rock samples to lighten the load, but couldn't bring himself to discard the valuable research materials. Instead, he adjusted the straps to shift more weight to his right side and began the slow journey back to camp. What would normally have been a 40-minute hike stretched into a 3-hour ordeal. Eric stopped frequently to rest, each time finding it harder to continue. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the constant movement had caused some seepage through the bandages. The pain medication from his first aid kit, just over-the-counter ibuprofen, barely took the edge off. Twice he heard rustling in the undergrowth that froze him in place, but neither instance materialized into another bear encounter. Darkness was falling by the time the welcome sight of his tent appeared through the trees. Eric's relief was tempered by caution. He scanned the area carefully before approaching, alert for any signs that the bear or another predator had visited in his absence. Finding none, he painfully made his way to the tent and collapsed just inside the entrance. After several minutes of simply breathing through the pain, Eric roused himself to action. He needed to properly treat his wounds, eat something to maintain his strength, and prepare for a long, potentially dangerous night. First, he secured the tent, zipping it closed and ensuring his remaining food items were in the bear-resistant container positioned 100 yards away as required by protocol. The camp stove provided blessed heat as he boiled water for rehydrating a meal and for additional wound cleaning. His first aid kit contained stronger antiseptics than the field version, along with proper bandages and butterfly closures. Removing his torn and bloodied clothing was an exercise in agony, but eventually he was able to get a better look at his injuries in the small mirror from his toiletry kit. The damage was worse than he'd initially thought. 3 deep parallel gashes ran diagonally across his left shoulder blade, with a 4th slightly shorter cut below them. The edges were ragged, and dirt and debris had been ground into the wounds despite his earlier cleaning efforts. A large bruise was already forming around the entire area, extending down his arm and across part of his back. His left arm had limited mobility, suggesting possible tendon damage, though he could still move his fingers, which he took as a positive sign. Eric carefully cleaned the wounds again, his teeth clenched against the pain. He applied antibiotic ointment liberally before covering them with sterile gauze and securing it with medical tape. The process took nearly 45 minutes, during which he had to rest several times as waves of dizziness threatened to overwhelm him. By the time he finished, the dehydrated beef stew he had prepared was cool enough to eat. Despite his situation, hunger made itself known, and he consumed the entire meal along with 2 energy bars from his supplies. Food and painkillers in his system, he set up his sleeping arrangement, positioning himself so that his injured shoulder wouldn't bear his weight. At 8 p.m. sharp, the satellite phone chirped. Eric answered, relieved to hear Pete's voice again. "How are you holding up?" Pete asked without preamble. "I made it back to camp. Wounds are cleaned and dressed. Pain's manageable." "Good man. Weather's still garbage up here, but the forecast shows improvement overnight. I'll be wheels up at first light, conditions permitting. You need to know, I've notified Park Service and the state troopers. They're on standby, but given your location and the weather, they're deferring to my extraction plan unless your condition deteriorates." "Understood. I'm stable for now. Keep it that way. Try to get some rest. I'll contact you at 0600. After ending the call, Eric settled in for what he knew would be a difficult night. Despite exhaustion pulling at him, sleep came in fitful, bursts interrupted by pain and the hyper-alertness that followed trauma. Every sound outside the tent, the rustle of wind through trees, the occasional crack of a branch, the pattering of renewed rainfall, triggered a surge of adrenaline. During one period of wakefulness, Eric heard what he was certain was an animal, moving around the perimeter of his camp. He lay perfectly still, barely breathing as the sounds circled his position. After about 20 minutes, they faded away. Whether it had been the same bear returning or another animal, he couldn't be sure, but the encounter left him even more on edge. The night stretched endlessly. Eric's wound began to throb with increasing intensity as the painkillers wore off, but he rationed his remaining doses, aware he might need them more urgently later. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with charging bears and endless wilderness. At some point in the early morning hours, Eric developed a fever. He recognized the signs, the alternating chills and heat, the slight disorientation, the increasing thirst, infection setting in already, faster than he would have expected. He forced himself to drink water, knowing dehydration would only compound his problems. The satellite phone's chirp at 6 a.m. startled him awake from a feverish doze. He fumbled for it, his coordination noticeably impaired. "Johnson here," he managed, his voice hoarse. "Eric, you don't sound good." Pete's concern was evident even through the connection. "Fever. Think infection's setting in. How soon can you get here?" There was a brief pause. "Weather's cleared enough for flight. I'm already prepped and doing final checks. Should be airborne in 15 minutes at your location in about an hour. Can you hold out?" "No choice," Eric repeated his words from yesterday. "I'll try to pack up what I can. Don't worry about equipment. Just be ready to move when I get there. I'm bringing a medical kit and have alerted the hospital in Anchorage to expect us." After the call ended, Eric forced himself to action despite the fever and pain. He gathered his essential research materials and personal items, leaving the tent and other equipment to be retrieved later. Simply pulling on a clean shirt over his bandaged shoulder nearly caused him to black out. By the time he had his critical belongings packed, he was sweating profusely despite the morning chill, and his vision occasionally blurred around the edges. The sound of an approaching aircraft had never been so welcome. Eric made his way painfully out of the tent and into the clearing by the lake where Pete would land. The effort left him dizzy and nauseated, but the sight of the familiar de Havilland beaver settling onto the lake's surface filled him with profound relief. Pete taxied as close to shore as possible, then secured the plane and waded through the shallow water to reach Eric. His expression tightened when he saw Eric's condition. "Jesus, you look like hell," he said, quickly moving to support Eric's right side. "Let's get you aboard." The short walk to the plane was almost more than Eric could manage. Pete practically carried him the last few yards, his concern evident in the careful way he helped Eric into the passenger seat. "Hospital's standing by," Pete said as he secured the doors and prepared for takeoff. "We'll be there in about an hour, just hang on." The flight passed in a blur for Eric. The fever had intensified, and periods of lucidity alternated with stretches where he was only vaguely aware of his surroundings. Pete's voice occasionally cut through the haze, asking questions to keep him alert or providing updates on their progress. Eric responded as best he could, fighting to remain conscious. Landing at Anchorage's Lake Hood seaplane base, they were met by an ambulance and emergency medical technicians. The transition from plane to stretcher to ambulance happened with efficiency that suggested Pete had indeed prepared them well. The EMTs immediately started an IV, administered antibiotics, and replaced Eric's makeshift bandages with proper sterile dressings. BP's 9060, pulse 118, temp 103.2, one of the EMTs reported as they loaded him into the ambulance. Definite signs of infection, significant blood loss but not currently critical. Eric tried to focus on Pete, who was hovering nearby. "My samples," he managed to say. "In my pack. I've got them," Pete assured him. "I'll bring everything to the hospital once you're settled. Don't worry about any of that now." The ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began moving, siren wailing. The last thing Eric remembered before losing consciousness was the EMT inserting something into his IV line and saying, "This should help with the pain, Dr. Johnson, just relax now." When Eric next became fully aware, he was in a hospital room. The light suggested it was daytime, though whether the same day or another, he couldn't tell. His shoulder and back were heavily bandaged, and an IV line ran into his right arm. The tati pain was still present but muted, likely due to whatever medication was being administered through the IV. A nurse noticed his open eyes and approached the bed. "Welcome back, Dr. Johnson. How are you feeling?" "Thirsty," Eric managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long?" "You've been here about 18 hours, she replied, pouring water from a pitcher and helping him drink through a straw. "The doctor will want to know you're awake. She can answer your questions better than I can." Within minutes, a woman in a white coat entered the room, carrying a tablet. "Dr. Johnson, I'm Dr. Ramirez. You're a very lucky man. Those bear claws came perilously close to severing major blood vessels. As it is, you have significant tissue damage, some minor tendon involvement, and a nasty infection we're still combating." "Prognosis?" Eric asked, falling back on clinical terminology to create some emotional distance from the situation. "With proper treatment and rehabilitation, we expect a good recovery. You'll have some impressive scars, and there may be some long-term mobility issues with your left shoulder, but nothing that should prevent you from returning to your work eventually." She paused, studying him. "You also have a mild concussion, likely from hitting the ground during the attack. Any gaps in your memory?" Eric considered the question. The event seemed mostly clear, though some portions of the attack itself and the hours immediately following were somewhat hazy. "Nothing significant," he concluded. "Good, that's a positive sign." Dr. Ramirez made some notes on her tablet. "You'll be our guest for at least a few more days while we get the infection under control. After that, we'll need to discuss follow-up care and rehabilitation options." "My research materials? Your friend Pete has been quite insistent about the importance of your rock samples," she said with a slight smile. "He stored everything safely and visits regularly to check on you. In fact, he's in the waiting area now if you feel up to a brief visit." Eric nodded, and minutes later, Pete entered the room, his weathered face breaking into a relieved smile. "There he is. Damn, Eric, you had me worried." "Sorry about that," Eric replied weakly. "Thanks for the rescue." "All part of the service," Pete said, but his light tone couldn't entirely mask the concern in his eyes. "Your rocks are safe, by the way. Got them stored in my office until you're back on your feet. Appreciate it." Eric shifted slightly and winced as the movement pulled at his injuries. "Did you report the attack?" "By the book," Pete confirmed. "Filed with Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, and state troopers. Wildlife officers want to interview you when you're up to it. Standard procedure for predator attacks." Eric nodded, expecting as much. Bear attacks were taken seriously, particularly in areas frequented by researchers and recreational users. "Any follow-up on the bear?" Pete shook his head. "They sent a team to the area, but with the rain and time elapsed before they could get. Their tracking was difficult. No sign of the bear when they checked your campsite to retrieve your equipment." They left the standard warning notices for the area, but without a bear showing repeated aggressive behavior, there's not much more they'll do. This was also expected. Resources were limited, and unless a bear demonstrated a pattern of human habituation or aggression, wildlife management typically employed a monitoring approach rather than removal. The attack on Eric, while serious, appeared to be an isolated incident, possibly triggered by his inadvertent stumble during a tense encounter. The conversation tired Eric more quickly than he anticipated. Pete noticed his flagging energy and stood to leave. "I'll let you rest. Call if you need anything at all, I mean it, anything." The next few days passed in a blur of medical procedures, pain management, and increasingly longer periods of lucidity as the antibiotics fought back the infection. By the third day, Eric was able to sit up in bed and eat regular meals. The doctors expressed cautious optimism about his recovery timeline. On the fourth day, 2 wildlife officers from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game arrived to interview him about the attack. Eric recounted the events as accurately as he could, answering their questions about the bear's behavior, its apparent health, and the specific circumstances of the encounter. "Based on your description, it sounds like a relatively normal defensive response," concluded Officer Michaels, the senior of the two. "You surprised each other, and when you stumbled, it triggered the charge. The fact that it left after the initial attack, rather than continuing or attempting to cache you, supports that assessment." "Do you think it was the same bear my pilot spotted signs of to the east?" Eric asked. Officer Michaels shrugged. "Possibly. That area has a healthy brown bear population. Without DNA evidence or distinctive markings, it's hard to say with certainty." "What happens now? With the bear, I mean. We've posted warnings in the area, but there's no plan for targeted removal. At this time," Officer Richards, the younger officer, explained, "the attack doesn't appear predatory in nature, and the bear's behavior, while unfortunate for you, was within normal parameters for a defensive encounter." Eric nodded, not surprised but feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of him understood the reasoning. The bear was behaving as bears do in their natural habitat. Another part, the part that woke up sweating from nightmares of teeth and claws, felt a more primal desire for the threat to be eliminated. "We would recommend avoiding that specific area for the remainder of the season," Officer Michaels added. "The bear may associate it with a negative human encounter now, which could potentially lead to increased defensive behavior if confronted again. Not planning any return trip soon," Eric assured them with a wry smile that turned into a grimace as his shoulder twinged. The officers left after completing their paperwork, promising to file the report and send Eric a copy for his records. It seemed so bureaucratic and anticlimactic, the terrifying, life-changing event, reduced to an incident report and warning signs that would likely be ignored or weather away within a season. On the 6th day, Dr. Ramirez declared the infection sufficiently controlled for Eric to be discharged, with strict instructions for wound care, medication adherence, and follow-up appointments. Pete arrived to drive him to a hotel where he would stay until cleared for travel back to his home in Fairbanks. USGS office has been calling daily, Pete informed him as they navigated through Anchorage traffic. "Your boss, Sullivan, I think, wants you to call when you're up to it." Eric nodded, unsurprised. Janet Sullivan, the regional director, was known for her concern for field personnel. He would call her later, after getting settled at the hotel. The following week was a strange limbo of recovery and paperwork. Eric spoke with Janet, assuring her he was on the mend and discussing how to salvage the research, despite the premature end to his fieldwork. He filed reports with the USGS about the incident, completed insurance forms, and scheduled follow-up medical appointments in Fairbanks. The media caught wind of the story. Bear attacks always generated interest, but with no fatality and the remote location, it merited only a small mention in local newspapers and a brief segment on Anchorage's evening news. Eric declined interview requests, preferring to process the experience privately rather than recount it for public consumption. 10 days after the attack, Eric was cleared to fly home to Fairbanks. Pete insisted on piloting him personally, bypassing commercial flights. "Can't trust those airline pilots," he joked. "They get nervous if there's a cloud within 50 miles. The flight gave them time to talk more openly than they had in the hospital or during brief hotel visits. As the Alaskan landscape unfolded below them, Eric found himself describing not just the physical aspects of the attack, but the psychological impact. The moments of certainty that he was about to die, the strange calm that had settled over him at points, and the new wariness he felt about the wilderness he had always loved. "That's normal," Pete assured him. "Had a similar experience after my float plane went down in '98. Took me months before I could fly without white-knuckling the controls, but it fades or at least changes form, becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. Eric appreciated the insight from someone who understood. Most of his colleagues and friends, while sympathetic, couldn't truly comprehend what the experience had been like. Pete, who had faced his own wilderness crisis, offered understanding without pity, exactly what Eric needed. Arriving in Fairbanks, Eric was met by his department's administrative assistant, Diane, who had volunteered to drive him home and help him get settled. His apartment felt simultaneously foreign and intensely familiar after his ordeal. Everyday objects and routines, now contextualized by his brush with mortality. The physical recovery proceeded largely as the doctors had predicted. The wounds healed gradually, leaving raised reddish scars across his shoulder and upper back. Physical therapy helped restore functionality to his left arm, though certain movements remained restricted and sometimes painful. By 8 weeks post-attack, Eric was cleared for light duty, allowing him to return to the USGS office for data analysis and report writing, even as field operations remained off-limits. The psychological recovery followed a less linear path. Eric experienced nightmares several times a week, reliving the attack with varying degrees of distortion. Ordinary sounds, a tree branch scraping against his window, a dog barking unexpectedly, could trigger momentary panic. He found himself hyper-vigilant, even in clearly safe environments, constantly scanning for threats. When he mentioned these symptoms during a medical follow-up, his doctor suggested he might be experiencing post-traumatic stress and recommended counseling. Initially resistant, Eric eventually agreed to see Dr. Leanne Harper, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery. "What you're experiencing is entirely normal," Dr. Harper assured him during their first session. "Your brain and body went through an extreme survival situation. The heightened awareness, the flashbacks, the anxiety, these are adaptive responses that helped humans survive for millennia. The problem is that they're continuing past their usefulness." Over several months of weekly sessions, Eric worked through the experience, developing coping strategies for the anxiety and techniques to manage flashbacks. Dr. Harper neither minimized his trauma nor allowed him to be defined by it, maintaining a balance that Eric found helpful. "Most people will never fully understand what you went through," she told him during one particularly difficult session. "And that's okay. You don't need them to understand. You just need them to respect that it changed you, and that the change isn't good or bad, it just is." As winter settled over Alaska, bringing the familiar extreme cold and limited daylight, Eric continued his recovery. The reduced daylight hours sometimes exacerbated his anxiety, but the knowledge that bears were hibernating provided a strange comfort. He focused on analyzing the samples he had collected before the attack, finding that they indeed supported his hypothesis about the region's geological formation. The work provided a welcome distraction and a sense of purpose. Janet Sullivan proved unexpectedly supportive, approving budget for additional lab analysis of Eric's limited samples and adjusting project timelines to accommodate his recovery. "The rocks have been there for millions of years," she said pragmatically. "They can wait another season if needed." In January, nearly 4 months after the attack, Eric presented his preliminary findings at a departmental meeting. Standing before his colleagues, pointing to slides and explaining formation processes, he felt a moment of normalcy that had been elusive since the attack. The questions focused on science rather than his experience, allowing him to step back into his identity as a geologist rather than a bear attack survivor. After the presentation, Janet asked him to stay behind for a brief conversation. "You're doing well with the recovery," she observed once they were alone, both physically and otherwise. Eric nodded, appreciating her directness. "Getting there. I'm putting together field assignments for the spring and summer. I need to know where your head is on that." The question hit a nerve, one that Eric had been avoiding examining too closely. The idea of returning to remote field sites sent a wave of anxiety through him, but the alternative, permanently restricting himself to lab work and analysis, felt like conceding too much to fear. "I want to go back out," he said after a moment, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Not alone, though. Not yet, maybe not ever again." Janet nodded, unsurprised. "I was thinking the same. We should implement a partner system for remote sites anyway. Your experience highlighted some flaws in our solo operator protocols. I can pair you with Garcia for the Wrangell Mountains project in May. He's experienced, level-headed, and might actually learn something from you if you can get him to stop talking long enough to listen." The prospect of working with Miguel Garcia, an enthusiastic younger geologist with excellent field skills, was actually appealing. Eric found himself nodding. That could work. Good. Take some time to think about specific preparations or equipment, modifications that might help you feel more secure. We'll make it happen. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Eric continued his preparation for returning to the field. He worked with Dr. Harper on specific strategies for managing anxiety in wilderness settings. He updated his emergency protocols, invested in additional safety equipment, and spent hours discussing contingency plans with Pete, who would again serve as their pilot. Miguel was enthusiastic about the partnership when Janet informed him, immediately reaching out to Eric to begin planning. "I've wanted to work with you for ages," he admitted during their first planning meeting, "though I wish it had happened under different circumstances." "Life rarely asks our preferences," Eric replied with a slight smile, "but I think we'll work well together." By May, when they departed for the Wrangell Mountains site, Eric felt as prepared as possible. The anxiety remained, surging at unexpected moments, but it no longer controlled him. The first time he stepped off the float plane onto a remote shoreline, his heart raced and his palms sweated, but he worked through the reaction using the techniques Dr. Harper had taught him. Miguel proved to be an ideal partner, competent, alert, and sensitive to Eric's occasional need to pause and recenter himself without drawing attention to it. They established efficient routines for fieldwork, maintaining proper bear safety protocols at all times. Eric found that having another person present significantly reduced his anxiety, allowing him to focus more fully on the geological work that had always been his passion. The Wrangell Mountains project proceeded without wildlife incidents, as did the subsequent summer assignments. Eric gradually reclaimed his professional confidence, even as he accepted that certain aspects of his approach to fieldwork had permanently changed. He became an advocate for enhanced safety protocols within the department, drawing on his experience to illustrate the importance of preparation and partnership in remote settings. In September, 1 year after the attack, Eric found himself back in the Kenai Peninsula, though at a different research site. Standing on a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness, he felt a complex mixture of emotions: respect, caution, appreciation, and a residual wariness that would likely never fully disappear. Miguel, setting up sampling equipment nearby, glanced over at him. "You good?" Eric nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape not just for potential threats, but for its beauty and scientific significance. "Yeah," he said, meaning it. "I'm good." The scars on his shoulder and back had faded from angry red to silvery white, still visible, but no longer raw. The psychological scars had similarly transformed, not gone, but integrated into his experience, in ways that sometimes still caused pain, but no longer dominated his life. He would never again take the wilderness for granted, never assume safety, never forget the power and indifference of nature. But he had reclaimed his place within it, albeit on slightly different terms. As they worked through the afternoon, Eric heard a rustling in nearby brush that momentarily accelerated his pulse. He and Miguel both paused, bear spray at the ready, until a moose cow and calf emerged briefly before continuing on their way. Eric released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, exchanged a glance with Miguel, and returned to his work. The wilderness had nearly taken his life, had certainly changed it, but had not claimed his passion or his purpose. And in that, Eric reflected as he carefully extracted a rock sample from an ancient seam, was perhaps the most important victory of all. Back at camp that evening, as the September twilight settled over the landscape, Pete arrived with supplies and updates. He had been coming more frequently than strictly necessary during this expedition, an unspoken acknowledgement of the anniversary and its potential impact. "All quiet?" Pete asked, helping unload the supplies. "Saw a moose and calf," Miguel offered. "Otherwise just rocks and trees." "Good rocks," Eric added with a small smile, telling us quite a story about this region's formation. Pete nodded, understanding that the comment was Eric's way of saying he was focused on his work rather than dwelling on the anniversary. "Weather report says we're clear for the next 3 days, then possibility of early snow. Might need to pull you out ahead of schedule if that system accelerates." "Works for me," Eric said. "We've got most of what we need already. Another 2 days should complete the essential sampling." As they settled around the camp stove for dinner, the conversation drifted to plans for the coming winter and potential research sites for the following season. The discussions were normal, practical, and grounding, exactly what Eric needed on this particular date. Later, after Miguel had retired to his tent, Pete lingered with Eric by the small, carefully maintained fire. "A year ago today," he said quietly, not needing to specify further. Eric nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. Been thinking about it, obviously. Not sure what I'm supposed to feel. Grateful to be alive? Angry it happened? Both, probably. Both. Is reasonable, Pete agreed. Changed you? Yes. For better or worse? Eric considered the question seriously. Just different. More aware of vulnerability. Less casual about risks. More appreciative of moments like this. He gestured to the fire, the camp, the night sky filled with stars. Not better or worse, just different. Pete nodded, satisfied with the answer. That's about as good as anyone can hope for after something like that. Being different without being broken. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer before Pete spoke again. You know, I fly these routes year after year, see the same mountains, lakes, forests, but they're never actually the same. Light's different. Weather's different, I'm different. Perspective changes everything. Eric understood what his friend was trying to say. His experience had irrevocably altered his perspective, but the world itself, including the wilderness he studied, remained what it had always been. His perception of it had changed, but its fundamental nature remained constant. There was something reassuring in that constancy. Thanks, Pete, he said simply, for everything. Pete nodded, knowing no further elaboration was needed. After another comfortable silence, he stood and stretched. Better get some sleep. Early flight tomorrow to check on Anderson's team up north. As Pete headed for his sleeping arrangement in the small cleared area where his plane was docked, Eric remained by the fire a little longer. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the darkening sky. In the distance, a wolf howled, followed by another answering call. The sounds were neither threatening nor comforting, simply part of the wilderness tapestry that had fascinated him since childhood. Eric added another small log to the fire, watching the sparks rise toward the stars. Tomorrow would bring more work, more data, more insights into the ancient processes that had shaped this land long before humans arrived to study it. The rocks didn't care about his scars or his nightmares or his changed perspective. They simply existed, telling their story to anyone patient enough to listen, and Eric was still listening despite everything. That, he decided, as he finally doused the fire and headed for his tent, was victory enough. In the year that followed his return to fieldwork, Eric gradually settled into new routines and perspectives. The panic attacks became less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. The nightmares similarly faded from weekly occurrences to monthly, then occasional. He continued sessions with Dr. Harper, though they reduced the frequency to monthly check-ins rather than weekly therapeutic interventions. Professionally, Eric found unexpected opportunities arising from his experience. His paper on the Kenai Peninsula, geological formations, based on the limited samples from his interrupted research trip, was well received by the academic community. More surprisingly, his subsequent article on safety protocols for solo researchers in remote locations, published in a wilderness management journal, attracted attention from multiple agencies and research institutions. They want you to give a presentation at the Interagency Wilderness Risk Management Conference, Janet informed him one morning, forwarding an email from the conference organizers, specifically about transitioning back to fieldwork after a traumatic wilderness incident. Eric's initial reaction was reluctance. He had never sought to be defined by the attack, but after consideration, he accepted. If his experience could help other researchers better prepare for and recover from wilderness incidents, perhaps some additional meaning could be extracted from the trauma. The presentation, delivered to a packed room of wilderness professionals from various agencies, was one of the most challenging things Eric had done since the attack itself. Speaking publicly about the psychological impact, the recovery process, and the ongoing management of trauma responses left him feeling exposed in ways that were uncomfortable, but ultimately cathartic. You can follow all the protocols, take every precaution, and still find yourself in a life-threatening situation, he concluded, looking out at the attentive faces. That's the nature of wilderness work. The goal isn't to eliminate risk. That's impossible. The goal is to develop resilience, both in our preparations and in our responses when things go wrong. Because in the field, it's not a question of if something will go wrong, but when and how severely. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Several attendees approached him afterward to share their own experiences or to ask specific questions about his recovery journey. Eric found these conversations unexpectedly meaningful, reinforcing his sense that sharing his story served a purpose beyond personal processing. When he returned to Fairbanks, he found an email from a researcher at the University of Montana who specialized in human-wildlife conflict. Dr. Eleanor Chen was conducting a study on the psychological impacts of bear attacks and was interested in interviewing Eric for her research. After some consideration, Eric agreed to participate. The interview, conducted via video conference, was detailed and occasionally difficult, but Dr. Chen's professional approach and clear commitment to improving wilderness safety made the process worthwhile. "One thing that's emerging from our research," she told him toward the end of their conversation, "is the importance of maintaining connection to the environments where incidents occurred. Those who find ways to safely return to wilderness settings generally report better long-term psychological outcomes than those who avoid them entirely after an attack." "That matches my experience," Eric acknowledged. "Going back was terrifying, but necessary. If I'd stopped doing field work, the bear would have taken more from me than just blood and tissue." Dr. Chen nodded. "Exactly. We are trying to develop better protocols for agencies to support employees returning to the field after traumatic incidents. Your insights will be valuable for that work." The conversation left Eric reflective about how his relationship with wilderness had evolved since the attack. The initial terror had given way to hypervigilance, which had gradually transformed into a more balanced awareness. He no longer took the wilderness for granted, but neither did he approach it primarily with fear. Instead, he had developed what he thought of as informed respect, a clear-eyed recognition of both the beauty and the danger inherent in wild places. This perspective influenced his approach to mentoring younger geologists as well. When the USGS implemented a formal partner system for remote fieldwork, based partly on his recommendations, Eric volunteered to help train new field teams. He emphasized not just technical skills and emergency procedures, but also psychological preparation and resilience. "The most dangerous thing in the wilderness isn't bears or weather or terrain," he told one group during a training session. "It's complacency. The moment you stop paying attention, stop respecting the environment you're in, that's when you become most vulnerable." 2 years after the attack, Eric received an unexpected email from Pete. Attached was a photograph taken by wildlife biologists conducting population surveys in the Kenai Peninsula. The image showed a large male brown bear with a distinctive white patch on its right shoulder. "Spotted near your old research site," Pete's message read. "Wildlife biologists think this might be your bear, based on location, size, and age estimate. Thought you might want to know he's still out there, doing bear things." Eric studied the photograph for a long time, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was no way to know with certainty if this was the same animal that had attacked him, but the possibility created an odd sense of connection. The bear hadn't been malicious or evil, it had simply reacted as a bear does when threatened. Like the rocks Eric studied, the bear existed according to its nature, indifferent to human interpretations or emotions. He saved the photograph, but didn't reply to Pete immediately. That evening, he went for a long walk along one of Fairbanks's river trails, considering his reaction to the image and what it meant for his ongoing recovery. The trail was well used and entirely safe, but it bordered wild areas where bears occasionally appeared during summer months. 2 years ago, he would have avoided such places entirely, or navigated them with paralyzing anxiety. Now he moved with awareness but not fear, scanning his surroundings regularly, but also appreciating the natural beauty. When he returned home, he finally replied to Pete's email. "Thanks for sharing this. Glad to know he's living his bear life. So am I, in my human way." The response was simple but encapsulated the perspective Eric had worked hard to develop. The attack had been a pivotal moment in his life, but it didn't define him. It had changed him but not broken him. He carried the experience, physically in his scars, psychologically in his altered perspective, but he wasn't carrying it for the bear or because of the bear. He was carrying it for himself as part of his own ongoing story. 3 years after the attack, Eric's career had evolved in ways he hadn't anticipated. While he still conducted fieldwork, he had also developed a secondary specialty in wilderness risk management, consulting with various agencies on their protocols for remote research operations. The scars on his back and shoulder had faded to thin silver lines, noticeable but no longer angry, much like the psychological wounds that had accompanied them. During a geological conference in Denver, Eric was approached by a representative from a publishing company that specialized in scientific and adventure narratives. They were interested in his story, particularly the interplay between scientific research and wilderness risk. "We think there's a book here," the representative, Melissa Tanner, explained over coffee. "Not just about the attack itself, but about the broader context, the research you were doing, why it matters, the risks inherent in field science, and how your perspective on all of it changed afterward." Eric's initial reaction was skepticism. His story had already been used for multiple training programs and safety protocols. Did it need to become a commercial product as well? But as Melissa outlined their vision for the book, focusing on the scientific aspects and practical safety implications rather than sensationalizing the attack, he found himself considering the possibility. "I'd want final approval on content," he said, "and I'd want the focus to remain on the science and safety aspects, not just the dramatic elements." "Absolutely," Melissa agreed. "We envision this as part of our Field Science series, which highlights the work being done by researchers in challenging environments. The bear attack would be a central element, certainly, but contextualized within your broader work and its importance." After consulting with Janet, who encouraged him to pursue the opportunity, and Dr. Harper, who thought writing the book might offer additional closure, Eric agreed to the project. Working with a science writer named David Laramie, he began the process of turning his experience into a narrative that would serve both educational and cautionary purposes. The writing process proved more emotionally demanding than Eric had anticipated. Revisiting certain moments, particularly the attack itself and the long night afterward, stirred up feelings and memories he had thought were well processed. Dr. Harper helped him navigate these moments, reminding him that healing wasn't linear, and that the writing itself could be part of his ongoing integration of the experience. When Field Notes from the Edge: Science, Survival and Safety in America's Wilderness was published, it received modest but positive attention within the scientific community and among outdoor enthusiasts. Eric did a limited book tour, speaking at universities and research institutions about both the geological findings and the safety implications of his experience. During a talk at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, a student asked him a question that gave him pause. "Do you ever feel grateful for the attack, given how it's shaped your career and perspective?" The audience grew quiet, clearly sensing the weight of the question. Eric considered his response carefully. "Grateful isn't the right word," he finally said. "I would never wish that experience on anyone, including my past self. But I can acknowledge that it changed me in ways that aren't entirely negative. I'm more aware of both vulnerability and resilience than I was before. I value different things. I approach my work with both greater caution and greater appreciation." He paused, finding the right words. "The attack is part of my story now. I can't separate who I am today from that experience any more than I can separate the scars from my skin. But I get to decide what meaning it has, what lessons I take from it, and how I carry it forward. That's where my agency lies." The answer seemed to satisfy both the student and the wider audience, and it reflected Eric's genuine perspective. He had stopped trying to compartmentalize the attack as a discrete, traumatic event, and had instead integrated it into his broader life narrative, not defining himself by it, but not denying its impact either. 4 years after the attack, Eric accepted a new position with the USGS that combined field research with program development, specifically focused on safety protocols for wilderness scientific operations. The role allowed him to continue his geological work while also applying the insights gained from his experience to improve systems that protected other researchers. During his final session with Dr. Harper, before moving to a new office in Juneau, they reflected on the journey from immediate trauma to integration and growth. "When you first came to see me," she said, "you were primarily focused on getting back to who you were before the attack. Over time, that shifted to accepting who you are after it. That's the essence of post-traumatic growth, not returning to a previous state but developing a new one that incorporates the experience." Eric nodded, recognizing the truth in her assessment. "I still have moments," he admitted. "Nightmares occasionally, startling at sudden movements or sounds, but they're not controlling my life anymore. They're just there like background noise." "And the wilderness itself? How do you feel about it now?" Eric considered the question, thinking about his most recent field expedition to the Brooks Range. "Respect," he said finally. "Not primarily fear, not blind love, but respect. Recognition that it operates according to its own rules, indifferent to human desires or expectations, and that I need to operate according to those rules when I'm in it." "That seems like a healthy perspective," Dr. Harper observed. "I think so. I'm not looking to conquer or dominate or even fully understand the wilderness, just to study it, learn from it, and return home safely after each encounter." As he prepared for his move to Juneau, Eric packed the few mementos he had kept from the attack, the incident report, a newspaper clipping, the photograph of the bear that might or might not have been his, and a small stone he had picked up from the clearing where the encounter occurred retrieved during a brief, supervised, return visit the summer after the attack. These items lived in a small wooden box, neither prominently displayed nor hidden away, simply part of the physical record of his life, like the scars themselves. His new apartment in Juneau had a view of mountains and forest, wilderness visible from the comfort and safety of his living room. Some evenings he would stand at the window with a cup of tea, watching the play of light on distant peaks or the movement of wildlife at the forest's edge. In those moments, he felt the complex interplay of emotions that now characterized his relationship with wild places: respect, appreciation, caution, wonder, and a deep awareness of both human vulnerability and resilience. The bear that had attacked him was likely still roaming the Kenai Peninsula, following its instinctive drives, feeding, mating, surviving. Eric sometimes thought about it, not with fear or hatred, but with a kind of detached recognition. Their paths had crossed briefly and violently, altering his life course significantly, while likely having minimal impact on the bear beyond a temporary adrenaline surge and perhaps increased wariness around humans. There was something humbling in that asymmetry, in the recognition that an event central to his narrative was merely peripheral to the bear's existence. It reinforced what his years of geological research had already taught him, that human concerns and timescales were minuscule in the broader context of natural processes. The rocks he studied had witnessed millions of years of evolution and extinction, of species rising and falling, of landscapes transforming through tectonic shifts and erosion. His encounter with the bear, momentous as it felt to him, was like the briefest gust of wind against a mountain face. This perspective helped place the attack in a context that Eric could live with, significant without being all-encompassing, impactful without being defining. He could acknowledge its importance in his personal and professional development without allowing it to overshadow the broader purpose and passion that drove his work. 5 years after the attack, Eric returned to the Kenai Peninsula as part of a comprehensive geological survey aimed at updating baseline data for the region. He wasn't alone. The team included 3 other geologists and a designated safety officer with wilderness first responder training. The protocols he had helped develop were in full effect, with each team member carrying appropriate safety equipment and maintaining regular communication. Standing at the edge of a lake not far from where the attack had occurred, Eric felt a momentary tightening in his chest, a brief acceleration of his heart rate. He acknowledged the physiological response without judgment, using the grounding techniques he had practiced over the years. The anxiety passed quickly, replaced by focused attention on the task at hand. Later that evening, as the team reviewed the day's findings around their camp stove, the safety officer Anika Patel approached Eric privately. "You doing okay? I noticed you seemed a bit tense earlier today." Eric appreciated the observation and the care behind it. Another change from the old days when such moments might have gone unremarked. "Past memories," he explained simply. "Nothing that interfered with the work." Anika nodded, understanding. "Just checking. That's my job after all." "And you do it well," Eric assured her. "The system works when we look out for each other." It was true. The protocols and partnerships he had helped implement had already prevented several potential incidents across various USGS field operations. No system could eliminate risk entirely. The wilderness remained inherently unpredictable, but they could mitigate it, prepare for it, and respond effectively when the unexpected occurred. As he prepared for sleep that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the Alaskan wilderness, Eric reflected on the journey from that first solitary expedition to this team-based approach. The bear had taken something from him: blood, tissue, a certain naive confidence, but had also indirectly given something: a deeper understanding of vulnerability and interdependence, a more nuanced relationship with wild places, and ultimately, a chance to transform personal trauma into systems that protected others. The trade wasn't one he would have chosen, given the option, but it was one he had come to accept and even find meaning within. Somewhere in these woods, perhaps the same bear continued its existence, unaware of its role in a human's life story, simply being what it was, a wild creature following ancient instincts in an indifferent landscape. And here was Eric, changed but not diminished, carrying the memory of their encounter not as a burden but as a thread in the complex weave of his life's experience. In the soft darkness of his tent, Eric closed his eyes and listened to the wilderness around him. The wind in the trees, the occasional call of a night bird, the distant splash of something entering water. The sounds were neither comforting nor threatening, simply present, like the scars on his body. and the memories in his mind. He had learned to live with all of it, to integrate rather than separate, to carry forward rather than leave behind. After a few moments he drifted into sleep, his dreams filled not with teeth and claws, but with the rocks and formations that had drawn him to this wild place, the true objects of his lifelong passion, waiting patiently to tell their ancient stories to anyone skilled and persistent enough to listen, to anyone willing to venture into the wilderness and return, changed, but wiser from the encounter.